Good morning. Good morning. Morning. Good morning. Raise your hands up if you are there. Oh yeah, I need to. I'm so not ready today because I woke up late again. Of course. Why am I not surprised? Um, sorry for the delay in reading. Good morning. Hello. Good morning. I need to set my reward so that people can't spam Nunamon every 3 minutes. Diane, have you started party? Yeah, started. Good. Okay.
Omoshiroi!
Yes, indeed. Very omoshiroi. I put danger song up for Ando, because I know Ando really likes the danger song. Okay, that should be okay. Sorry guys, I just woke up about 20 minutes ago. And then I'm bombarded by a lot of information about the Seraphim. And I'm like, I want that Yunjin. My local group order person posted a million things about the Seraphim upcoming new album. And I'm like, I don't even know the concept yet. Why am I buying this? Like, so I'm gonna wait for the album. But she opened up some loose items, and I managed to get a Yunjin photo card. My Korea boost set is all coming out now. I got Yunjin's photo card, man. Diane, do you want Unche's photo card? I can buy it now. It's very cheap. I can buy it for you, Diane. Just say yes. Just say yes and I'll buy it for you. Oh god. I can do a fan call thingy if I buy an album from Weavers, but it's a raffle. Only 50 people will win. So I don't think I will win. It's impossible, basically. Seeing how many fans they have. That's insane. you can't start having one unche, right? If you start having one unche, you'll have to continue getting more unche. I get what you mean. You know? Oh yeah, you know. My first photo card from the Seraphim was Garam. It was hilarious. I'm waiting for her to like, you know, somehow get famous again, then sell her card at an exorbitant price. I don't know why. I don't know how people want. I don't understand why people want to buy a pre-order version. I mean, I understand there's like a lot of like uh, stuff that comes with pre-orders, but you don't even know how the album looks like yet. Like, why would you want to? I don't know. Just my opinion. I wanna wait until I buy it. I'm not gonna give a shit. I have a bread. I have a book. I have a bread book. I have a coffee. I have a book. Coffee book. Can't stop eating. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, guys. Hey, it's my stream. I do whatever I want. Except for those who are listening from YouTube. I truly apologize for you to having to listen to me chew a bread. Pre-order bonus are limited and comeback time. Fans are hyped. Well, I guess I'm the most calm and reasonable fan out there. Okay. Give me a little bit more time. This is why I never fucking managed to read on time or anything. Okay. Alright, I think we can start reading now. Okay, let's start. Good morning. Today we are reading one of my favorite authors, Kazuo Ishiguro, a British Japanese writer who has won Nobel Peace Prize on Literature. Kazuo Ishiguro's When We Were Orphans. Part 1. London, 24th July 1930. We have another period piece this time with Kazuo Ishiguro. The next Kazuo Ishiguro book that I'm going to read is going to be more modern, I would say. Chapter 1 of When We Were Orphans by Kazuo Ishiguro. It was the summer of 1923, the summer I came down from Cambridge, despite my aunt's wishes that I return to Shropshire. I decided my future lay in the capital and took up a small flat at number 14B, Bedford Gardens in Kensington. I remember it now as the most wonderful of summers. After years of being surrounded by fellows, both at school and at Cambridge, I took great pleasure in my own company. I enjoyed the London parks, the quiet of the reading room at the British Museum. I indulged entire afternoons strolling the streets of Kensington, outlining to myself my plans for my future, pausing once in a while to admire how here in England, even in the midst of such a great city, creepers and ivy are to be found clinging to the front of fine houses. It was on one such leisurely walk that I encountered quite by chance by an old school friend, James Osborne. Discovering him to be a neighbor, suggested he call on me when he was next passing. Although at the point I had yet to receive a single visitor in my rooms, I issued my invitation with confidence, having chosen the premises with some care. The rent was not high, but my landlady had furnished the place in a tasteful manner that evoked an unhurried Victorian past. The drawing room, which received plenty of sunlight throughout the first half of the day, contained an aging sofa, as well as two snug armchairs, an antique sideboard, and an oak bookcase filled with crumbling encyclopedias, all of which I was convinced would win the approval of any visitor. Moreover, almost immediately upon taking the rooms, I had walked over to the Knightsbridge and acquired there a Queen Anne tea service, several packets of fine tea, and a large tin of biscuits. So when Osborne did happen along one morning a few days later, I was able to serve out the refreshments with an assurance that I never once permitted him to suppose he was my first guest. For the first 15 minutes or so, Osborne moved restlessly around my drawing room, complimenting me on the premises, examining this and that, looking regularly out of the windows to exclaim at whatever was going on below. Eventually, he flopped down into the sofa, and we were able to exchange news, our own and that of old school friends. I remember we spent a little time discussing the activities of workers' unions before embarking on a long and enjoyable debate on German philosophy, which enabled us to display to one another the intellectual prowess we each had gained at our respective universities. Then Osborne rose and began his pacing again, pronouncing as he did so upon his various plans for the future. I have mind to go into publishing, you know. Newspapers, magazines, that sort of thing. In fact, I fancy writing a column myself about politics, social issues. That is, as I say, if I decide not to go into politics myself. I say, Banks, do you really have no idea what you want to do? Look, it's all out there for us. He indicated the window. Surely you have some plans. I suppose so, I said, smiling. I have one or two things in mind. I'll let you know in good time. What have you got up your sleeve? Come on, out with it. I'll get it out of you yet. But I revealed nothing to him, and before long got him arguing again about philosophy or poetry or some such thing. Then, around noon, Osborne suddenly remembered a lunch appointment in Piccadilly and began to gather up his belongings. It was as he was leaving. He turned at the door, saying, "Look, old chap, I meant to say to you, I'm going along tonight to a bash. It's in honor of Leonard Evershot, the tycoon, you know. An uncle of mine's giving it. Rather short notice, but I wonder if you care to come along. I'm quite serious. I had been meaning to pop over to you long ago, just never got around to it. It'll be at the Charingworth." When I did not reply immediately, he took a step towards me and said, "Sorry. I thought of you because I was remembering. How you always used to quiz me about my being well connected. Oh, come on. Don't pretend you have forgotten. You used to interrogate me mercilessly. Well connected. Just what does that mean, well connected? Well, I thought here's a chance for old Banks to see well connected for himself." Then he shook his head as though at a memory, saying, "My goodness, you were such an odd bird at school." I believed it was at this point I finally assented to his suggestion for the evening, an evening which, as I shall explain, was to prove far more significant than I could then have imagined, and showed him out without betraying in any part of the resentment I was feeling at these last words of his. My annoyance only grew once I had sat down again. I had, as it happened, guessed immediately what Osborne had been referring to. In fact, throughout school I had heard it repeatedly of Osborne that he was well connected. It was a phrase that came up unfailingly when people talked of him, and I believe I too used it about him whenever it seemed called for. It was indeed a concept that fascinated me, this notion that he was in some mysterious way connected to various of the higher walks of life, even though he looked and behaved no differently from the rest of us. However, I cannot imagine I mercilessly interrogated him, as he had claimed. It is true, the subject was something I thought about a lot when I was 14 or 15, but Osborne and I had not been especially close at school, and as far as I remember, I only once brought it up with him personally. It was on a foggy autumn morning, and the two of us had been sitting on a low wall outside a country inn. My guess is that we would have been in the fifth by then. We had been appointed as markers for cross-country run, and we were waiting for the runners to emerge from the fog across the nearby field, so that we could point them to the correct direction down a muddy lane. We were not expecting the runners for some time yet, and had been so idly chatting. It was on this occasion, I am sure, that I asked Osborne about his well-connectedness. Osborne, who, for all his exuberance, had a modest nature, tried to change the subject, but I persisted until he said eventually, "Oh, do knock it off, Banks. It's just all nonsense. There's nothing to analyze. One simply knows people. One has parents, uncles, family, friends. I don't know what there is to be puzzled about. Then, quickly realizing what he had said, he had turned and touched my arm. Dreadfully sorry, old fellow. That was awfully tactless of me. 1 second for coffee. This faux pas seemed to cause Osborne much more anguish than it had me. Indeed, it is not impossible it had remained on his conscience for all these years, so that in asking me to accompany him to Sherringworth Club that evening, he was in some way trying to make amends. In any case, as I say, I had not been at all that upset that foggy morning by his admittedly careless remark. In fact, it had become a matter of some irritation to me that my school friends, for all their readiness to fall into banter concerning virtually any other one's misfortune, would observe a great solemnness at the first mention of my parents' absence. Actually, odd as it may sound, my lack of parents, indeed, of any close kin in England except for my aunt in Shropshire, had by then long ceased to be of any great inconvenience to me. I would often point out to my companions at a boarding school like ours, we had all learned to get on without parents, and my position was not at all that unique. Nevertheless, now I look back on it, it seemed probable that at least some of my fascination with Osborne's well-connectedness had to do with what I then perceived to be my complete lack of connection with the world beyond St. Dunstan's. That I would, when the time came, forge such connections for myself and make my way. I had no doubts. But it is possible I believe I would learn from Osborne something crucial, something of the way such things worked. But when I said before that Osborne's words as he left my flat had somewhat offended me, I was not referring to his raising the matter of my interrogating him all those years before. Rather, what I had taken exception to was his casual judgment that I had been such an odd bird at school. In fact, it has always been a puzzle to me that Osborne should have said such a thing of me that morning, since my own memory is that I blended perfectly into English school life. During even my earliest weeks at St. Dunstan's, I do not believe I did anything to cause myself embarrassment. On my very first day, for instance, I recall observing a mannerism many of the boys adopted when standing and talking, of tucking the right hand into the waistcoat pocket and moving the left shoulder up and down in a kind of shrug to underline certain of their remarks. I distinctly remember reproducing this mannerism on the same first day with sufficient expertise that not a single of my fellows noticed anything odd or thought to make fun. In such the same bold spirit, I rapidly absorbed the other gestures, turn of phrase and exclamations popular among my peers, as well as grasping the deeper mores and etiquette prevailing in my new surroundings. I certainly realized quickly enough that it would not do for me to indulge openly, as I had been routinely doing in Shanghai, my ideas on crime and its detection. So much so that even when during my third year there was a series of thefts and the entire school was enjoying playing detective, I carefully refrained from joining in all but in a nominal way, and it was, no doubt, some remnant of this same policy that caused me to reveal so little of my plans to Osborne that morning he called on me. However, for all my caution, I can bring to mind at least 2 instances from school that suggest I must, at least occasionally, have lowered my guard sufficiently to give some idea of my own ambitions. I was unable even at the time to give account for these incidents, and I am no closer to doing so today. The earlier of these occurrences on the occasions of my 14th birthday, my 2 good friends of the time, Robert Thornton Brown and Russell Stanton, had taken me to a tea shop in the village, and we had been enjoying ourselves over scones and cream cakes. It was a rainy Saturday afternoon, and all of the other tables were occupied. This meant that every few minutes more rain-soaked villagers would come in, look around and throw disapproving looks in our direction as though we should immediately vacate our table for them. But Mrs. Jordan, the proprietress, had always been welcoming towards us, and on that afternoon of my birthday, we felt we had every right to be occupying the choice table beside the bay window, with its view of the same village square. I do not recall much of what we talked about that day, but once we had eaten our fill, my two companions exchanged looks. Then Thornton Brown reached down into his satchel and presented to me a gift-wrapped package. As I set about opening it, I quickly realized the package had been wrapped in numerous sheets, and my friends would laugh noisily each time I removed one layer, only to be confronted by another. All the signs then were that I would find some joke item at the end of it all. What I did eventually uncover was a weathered leather case. When I undid the tiny catch and raised the lid, a magnifying glass. I have it here now before me. Its appearance has changed little over the years. It was on that afternoon already well traveled. I remember noting this, along with the fact that it was very powerful, surprisingly weighty, and that ivory handle was chipped all the way down one side. I did not notice until later one needs a second magnifying glass to read the engraving, that it was manufactured in Zurich in 1887. My first reaction to this gift was one of huge excitement. I snatched up, brushing aside the bundles of wrappings covering the table surface. I suspect, in my enthusiasm, I caused a few sheets to flutter to the floor and began immediately to test it on some specks of butter smeared on the tablecloth. I became so absorbed that I was only vaguely aware of my friends laughing in that exaggerated way that signifies a joke at one's expense. By the time I looked up, finally self-conscious, they had both fallen into an uncertain silence. It was then that Thornton Brown gave a half-hearted snigger, saying, "We thought since you're going to be a detective you'd be needing one of these." At this point, I quickly recovered my wits and made a show of pretending the whole thing had been an amusing jest. But by then, I fancy, my two friends were themselves confused about their intentions, and for the remainder of our time at the tea shop, we never quite regained our former comfortable mood. As I say, I have the magnifying glass here now in front of me. I used it when investigating the Mainwaring case. I used it again, most recently during the Trevor Richardson affair. A magnifying glass may not quite be the crucial piece of equipment of popular myth, but it remains a useful tool for the gathering of certain sort of evidence, and I fancy I will, for some time yet, carry about with me my birthday gift from Robert Thornton Brown and Russell Stanton. Gazing at it now, this thought occurs to me. If my companion's intention was indeed to tease me, well then, the joke is very now much on them. But sadly, I have no way now of ascertaining what they had in mind, nor indeed how. For all my precautions, they had never gleaned my secret ambition. Stanton, who had lied about his age in order to volunteer, was killed in the Third Battle of Ypres. Thornton Brown, I heard, died of tuberculosis 2 years ago. In any case, both boys left St. Dunstan's in the 5th year, and I had long since lost touch with them by the time I heard of the deaths. I still remember, though, how disappointed I was when Thornton Brown left the school. He had been one real friend I had made since arriving in England. I missed him so much throughout the latter part of my career at St. Dunstan's. The second of the two instances that comes to mind occurred a few years later in the lower sixth, but my collection of it is not as detailed. In fact, I cannot remember at all what came before and after this particular moment. What I have is a memory of walking into a classroom, room 15 in the old priory, where the sun was pouring through the narrow cloister window in shafts, revealing the dusk hanging in the air. The master had yet to arrive, but I must have come in slightly late, for I remember finding my classmates already sitting about in clusters on the desktops, benches, and window ledges. I was about to join one such group of 5 or 6 boys when their faces all turned to me, and I saw immediately that they had been discussing about me. Then, before I could say anything, one of the group, Roger Brenthers, pointed towards me and remarked, "But surely he's rather too short to be a Sherlock." A few of them laughed, not particularly unkind, and that, as far as I recall, was all there was to it. I never heard any further talk concerning my aspiration to be a Sherlock, but for some time afterward I had a niggling concern that my secret had got out and become a topic of discussion behind my back. Incidentally, the need to exercise caution around the whole topic of my ambitions had been impressed upon me before I ever arrived at St. Dunstan's, for I had spent much of my first few weeks in England wandering about the common near my aunt's cottage in Shropshire, performing amidst the damp ferns the various detective scenarios Akira and I evolved together in Shanghai. Of course, now that I was alone, I was obliged to take on all his roles as well. Moreover, aware as I was that I could be seen from the cottage, I had had the sense to enact these dramas with restrained movements, muttering our lines under my breath, in marked contrast to the uninhibited manner in which Akira and I had been accustomed to carry on. Such precautions, however, had proved inadequate, for one morning I had overheard from the little attic room I had been given my aunt talking with some friends down in the drawing room. It was the sudden lowering of their voices that had first aroused my curiosity, and I soon found myself creeping out on the landing and leaning over the rail. "He's gone for hours," I could hear her saying. "He's hardly healthy. A boy his age, sunk in his own world like that. He has to start looking ahead." "But it's only to be expected, surely," someone said, "after everything that's happened to him." "He has nothing at all to gain by brooding," my aunt said. "He's been well provided for, and in that sense he has been lucky. It's time that he looked forward. I mean to put a stop to all this introspection." From that day on, I ceased to go to the common, and in general took steps to avoid any further display of introspection. But I was still very young, and at night, lying in that attic room, listening to the creaks of the board as my aunt moved about the cottage, winding her clocks and singing to her cats, I would often enact again in my imagination all our detective dramas in just the way Akira and I had always done. But then, but but let me return to the summers at Osborne called at my Kensington flat. I do not wish to imply that the remark of his about my being an odd bird preoccupied me for more than a few moments. In fact, I went out myself not long after Osborne in rather good spirits, and was soon to be found in St. James Park strolling about the flower beds, growing ever more eager for the evening ahead. Thinking again of that afternoon, it strikes me that I had every right to feel a little nervous, and it is entirely typical of the foolish arrogance that carried me through those early London days that I did not. I was aware, of course, that this particular evening would be on a different level from anything I had ever attended at university, that I might as well, moreover, encounter points of custom as yet unfamiliar to me, but I felt sure I would, with my usual vigilance, negotiate any such difficulties, and in general acquit myself well. My concerns as I drifted around the park were of a were of a quite different order. When Osborne had talked of well-connected guests, I had immediately assumed this to include at least a few of the leading detectives of the day. I fancy then that I spent a lot of my time that afternoon working out just what I would say should I be introduced to Matlock Stevenson, or perhaps even to Professor Charville. I remember I rehearsed over and over how I would modestly but with a certain dignity outline my ambitions, and I pictured to myself one or the other of them taking a fatherly interest in me, offering offering all kinds of advice and insisting I come to him for guidance in the future. One second for tea. Alright. Of course, the evening turned out to be a major disappointment, even if you will presently see. It was to prove particularly significant for quite other reasons. What I did not know at this point was that in this country, detectives tend not to participate in social gatherings. This is not through any lack of invitations. My own recent experience will testify to the fact that fashionable circles are forever trying to recruit the celebrated detectives of the day. It is just that these same persons tend to be earnest, often reclusive individuals who are dedicated to their work and have little inclination to mingle with one another, let alone with society at large. As I say, this was not something that I appreciated as I arrived at the Sherringworth Club that evening, and followed as Osborne's example of cheerily greeting the grandly uniformed doorman. But I was quickly disabused within minutes of our entering to the crowded room on the first floor. I do not know how exactly this occurred, for I had not had the time to ascertain the identities of anyone present, but a kind of intuitive revelation swept over me, which made me feel utterly foolish about my early excitement. Matlock Stevenson or Professor Shelville hobnobbing with the financiers and government ministers I knew were around me. Indeed, I was so thrown by this discrepancy between the event I had arrived at and the one that I had been thinking about throughout the afternoon that all my poise, at least temporarily, deserted me, and for half an hour or so, much to my annoyance, I could not bring myself to leave Osborne's side. I am sure that this same agitated frame of mind accounts for the fact that when I now think back to that evening, so many aspects seem somewhat exaggerated or unnatural. For instance, when I now try to picture the room, it is uncommonly dark. This despite the wall lamps, the candles on the tables, and the chandeliers above us, none of which seemed to make any impression on the pervading darkness. The carpet is very thick, so that to move around the room one is obliged to drag one's feet, and all around, graying men in black jackets are doing just this. Some even pressing forward their shoulders as if walking into gale. The waiters, too, with their silver trays, leaning into conversations at peculiar angles. There are hardly any ladies present, and this one can seem oddly self-effacing, almost immediately melting from one's view behind the forest of the black evening suits. As I say, I am sure these impressions are not accurate, but that is how the evening remains in my mind. I remember standing about frozen with awkwardness, repeatedly sipping from my glass as Osborne chatted amiably with one guest after another, most of them a good 30 years older than us. I did once or twice try to join in, but my voice sounded conspicuously childlike, and in any case, most conversations centered on people or issues about which I knew nothing of. After a while, I grew angry at myself, at Osborne, at the whole proceedings. I felt I had every right to despise the people around me, that they were, for the most part, greedy and self-seeking, lacking any idealism or sense of public duty. Fueled by this anger, I was at last able to tear myself away from Osborne and move off through the darkness into another part of the room. I came to an area illuminated by a dull pool of light cast by a small wall lantern. The crowd was thinner here, and I noticed a silver-haired man of perhaps 70 smoking with his back to the room. It took a moment for me to realize he was gazing into a mirror, and by then he had noticed me looking at him. I was about to hurry on when he said without turning, "Enjoying yourself?" Oh, oh yes, I said with a light laugh. "Thank you, yes. A splendid occasion. But a little lost, eh?" I hesitated, then gave another laugh. "Perhaps a little, sir. Yes, sir." The silver-haired man turned and studied me carefully. He then said, "If you wish, I'll tell you who some of these people are. Then if there's anyone you want to especially talk to, I'll take you over and introduce you. What do you say to that?" "That would be most kind indeed." "Good." He came a step closer and surveyed what was visible to us off the room. Then, leaning towards me, he proceeded to point out this personage and that. Even when the name was an illustrious one, he would remember to add, for my benefit, the financier, the composer, or whatever. With the less well-known, he would summarize in some detail that the person's career and the reason of his importance. I believe he was in the midst of telling me about a clergyman standing quite near us when he broke off suddenly and said, "Ah, I see the attention has drifted. I'm terribly sorry, sir." "Quite all right. Perfectly natural, after all. Young fellow like you." "I assure you, sir, no apologies required." He gave a laugh and nudged my arm. "Find her pretty, eh?" I did not know quite how to respond. I could hardly deny I had been diverted by the young woman several yards to our left, at the moment in conversation with the two middle-aged men. But as it happened, the first time I saw her, I did not think her at all pretty. It is even possible I somehow sensed that there and then, at my first sight of her, those qualities which I have since discovered to be significantly a part of her. What I saw was a small, rather elf-like young woman with dark, shoulder-length hair, even though at that moment she was clearly wishing to charm the man she was talking to. I could see something about her smile that might in an instant turn into a sneer. A slight crouch around her shoulders, like that of a bird of prey, gave her a posture of suggestion of scheming. Above all, I noticed a certain quality around her eyes, a kind of severity, something ungenerously exacting, which I can see now in retrospect was what more than anything else caused me to stare at her with such fascination that evening. Then, as we both still gazing at her, she looked our way, and recognizing my companion, sent him a quick cold smile. The silver-haired man gave a salute and respectful bow of the head. "A charming young lady," he murmured, as he began leading me away. "But no sense in a chap like you wasting time pursuing her. I don't mean to be offensive, but you look a jolly decent type. But you see, that's Miss Hemmings, Miss Sarah Hemmings." That name meant nothing to me, but whereas my guide had earlier been so conscientious conscientious in supplying me with the backgrounds of those he had pointed out. He asked the name of this woman, clearly expecting me to be familiar with it, so it was that I nodded and said, "Oh yes, so that's Miss Hemmings." The gentleman paused again and surveyed the room for our new vantage point. "Now, let me see. I take that you are looking for someone to give you a leg up in life, correct?" "Don't worry. Played much the same game myself when I was young. Now let me see. Who do we have here?" Then he turned back to me suddenly to ask, "Now, what was it again that you said you want to do with your life?" Of course, I had not at that point told him anything. But now, after a slight hesitation, I answered simply, "Detective, sir." "Detective? He continued to gaze around the room. "You mean a policeman?" "More a private consultant." He nodded. Naturally, naturally." He continued to draw on his cigar, deep in thought. Then he said, "Not interested in museums by any chance? Chap over there. Known him for years. Museums, skulls, relics, and all that kind of thing. Not interested?" "Didn't think so." He went on gazing around the room, sometimes craning his neck to see someone. "Of course," he said eventually. "A lot of young men dream of becoming detective. I dare say I did once, in my more fanciful moments. One feels so idealistic at your age, longs to be the great detective of today, to root out single-handedly all the evils in the world. Commendable. But really, my boy, it's just as well to have, let us say, a few other strings to your bow. Because a year or two from now, I don't mean to be offensive, but pretty soon you'll feel quite differently about things. Are you interested in furniture?" I asked because over there stands none other than Hamish Robertson himself. "With all respect, sir, the ambition which I had just confided to you is hardly the whim of a moment. It is a calling I've felt my whole life." "Your whole life? But what are you? 21? 22? Well, I suppose I shouldn't discourage you. After all, if our young men won't entertain idealistic notions of this sort, who is there to do so? And no doubt, my boy, you believe today's world to be far more evil place than the one 30 years ago. Is that it? The civilization is on the brink and all that?" "As a matter of fact, sir," I said curtly, "I do believe that to be the case." "I remember when I thought so too." Suddenly his sarcasm had been replaced by a more kindly tone, and I even thought I saw tears fill his eyes. "Why is it, do you suppose, my boy? Is the world really getting more evil? Is Homo sapiens degenerating as a species?" "I don't know about that, sir," I replied, this time more gently. "All I can say is that to the objective observer, the modern criminal is growing increasingly clever. He has grown more ambitious, more daring, and science has placed a whole new array of sophisticated tools at his disposal." "I see. And without gifted chaps like you on your side, on our side, the future's bleak, is that it?" He shook his head sadly. "You might have something there. Too easy for an old chap like me to scoff." "Perhaps you are right, my boy. Perhaps we have allowed things to slide for too long. Ah." The silver-haired man bowed his head again as Sarah Hemmings came drifting past us. She was moving through the crowd with a haughty grace, her gaze moving from left to right in search, so it seemed to me, of someone she deemed worthy of her presence. Noting my companion, she gave him the same quick smile as before, but did not break her stride. For just a second, her gaze fell on me, but almost instantly before I could so much as to smile, she had dismissed me from her mind and was making her way towards someone she had spotted on the other side of the room. later that night, as Osborne and I sat together in a taxicab, speeding us back towards Kensington, I tried to find out something more concerning Sarah Hemmings. Osborne, for all his pretending that he had found the evening a bore, was well pleased with himself, eager to recount to me in detail the many conversations he had had with influential persons. It was not easy then to get him on to the subject of Miss Hemmings without my appearing unduly curious. Eventually, however, I did get him to say, "Miss Hemmings? Oh yes, her. Used to be engaged to Harriet Louise. You know, the conductor fellow? Then he went and gave that Schubert concert at the Albert Hall last autumn. Remember the debacle?" When I confessed my ignorance of it, Osborne went on. "They didn't quite throw chairs about, but I dare say they would have done if the things hadn't been fixed on the floor. The fellow from the Times described the performance as a complete travesty. Or did he say a violation? Anyway, he didn't care much for it, and Miss Hemmings dropped him like a hot potato. Threw the engagement ring back at him, apparently, and she has kept a huge distance from the chap ever since. All because of that concert? Well, it was pretty ghastly, by all accounts. Caused quite a stir, her breaking off the engagement, I mean. But what a lot of the bores they were tonight, Banks. Do you suppose we're that age we'll be carrying on like that? During the first year after Cambridge, largely through my friendship with Osborne, I found myself attending other smart social events on a fairly regular basis. Thinking back to that period of my life, now it now strikes me as singular frivolous ones. There were supper parties, luncheons, cocktail parties held occasionally in apartments around Bloomsbury and Holborn. I was determined to put behind me the awkwardness I had displayed that evening at Sherringworth, and my manner at these events grew steadily more assured. Indeed, for a time, it is reasonable for me to say I came to occupy a place within one of the fashionable London sets. Miss Hemmings was not part of my particular set, but I found that whenever I mentioned her to friends, they would know of her. Moreover, I would glimpse her from time to time at functions, or else often in the tea rooms of the grander hotels. In any case, in one or another, I ended up accumulating fair amount of information concerning her career in the London society. How curious to recall a time when such a vague second-hand impressions were all I knew of her. It did not take long to establish that there were many who did not regard her with approval. Even before the business of the broken engagement to Anthony Harriet Louise, it seemed he had made enemies on account of what many referred to her as forthrightness. Friends of Harriet Louise, whose objectivity, to be fair, could hardly be counted on by this point, described how ruthlessly she had pursued the conductor. Others accused her of manipulating Harriet Louise friends in order to get close to him. Her subsequent dropping off the conductor after all her determined efforts was viewed by some as puzzling, by others simply as conclusive evidence of her cynical motives. On the other hand, I came across plenty who spoke rather well of Miss Hemmings. She frequently described as clever, fascinating, complicated. Women in particular defended her right to break off an engagement whatever her reasons. Even her defenders, however, agreed that she was a terrible snob of a new sort, that she did not consider a person worthy of respect unless he or she possessed a celebrated name. And I must say, observing her from afar, I did that year, I came across a little to counter such claims. Indeed, I sometimes got the impression that she was unable properly to breathe anything that other than the air surrounding the most distinguished persons. For a time, she became linked with Henry Quinn, the barrister, only to distance herself again after his failure at the Charles Browning case. Then again, there came rumors of her growing friendship with James Bacon, who at the time was a rising young government minister. In any case, by this point, it had become abundantly clear to me that the the silver-haired man had meant what the silver-haired man had meant when he had declared there was little point in a chap like me pursuing Miss Hemmings. Of course, I had not really understood his words at the time. Now that I did so, I found myself following Miss Hemmings' activities with a peculiar interest that year. For all that, I did not actually speak to her until one afternoon, almost 2 years after I first saw her at the Sharingworth Club. Sorry. One moment, please. I had been taking tea at the Waldorf Hotel with an acquaintance when some business had suddenly called him away. I was thus sitting there by myself on the floor of the palm court, indulging in the scones and jam, when I noticed Miss Hemmings also sitting alone at one of the balcony tables. As I've said, this was by no means the first time I had glimpsed her at such places, but that afternoon things were different, for this was barely a month after the conclusion of the Mannering case, and I was still on something of a cloud. Certainly that period after my first public triumph was a heady one. Many new doors suddenly opened to me, invitations poured in from an entirely new resources. Those people who previously had been no more than pleasant to me exclaimed with great enthusiasm when I entered the room. It is no wonder I lost my bearings a little. In any case, on that afternoon at Waldorf, I found myself rising and making my way up to the balcony. I am not sure what I expected. It is again typical of my smugness of those days that I did not stop to consider if Miss Hemmings would be would really be so delighted to make my acquaintance. Perhaps a flicker of doubt did cross my mind as I strolled past the pianist and approached the table where she sat reading her book. But I remember feeling rather pleased with the way my voice came out, urbane and jocular, as I said, "Excuse me, but I thought it time I introduced myself to you. We have so many mutual friends. I am Christopher Banks." I managed to pronounce my name with a flourish, but already by this point my assurance had started to fade, for Miss Hemmings was looking up at me with a cold, searching gaze. In the silence that followed, she gave a quick glance back to her book as though it had let out a groan of complaint. Finally, she said in a voice filled with bafflement, "Oh yes? How do you do?" "The Mannering case," I said foolishly. "You might have read about it." "Yes, you investigated it." It was this utterance made so matter-of-factly which quite threw me off my balance. For she had spoken with no note whatsoever. It was simply a flat statement implying that she had been quite aware of my identity all along, and that she was still far from being enlightened as to why I was standing beside her table. Suddenly, I felt the giddy elation of the past weeks evaporating, and I believe it was then, as I let out a nervous laugh, it occurred to me that the Mannering case, for all the self-evident brilliance of my investigation, for all the praise of my friends, somehow did not carry as much importance in the wider world as I had assumed. It is quite possible we had a perfectly civil exchange before I began my retreat back down to my own table, and it seems to me that today that Miss Hemmings was more than entitled to respond as she did. How absurd to have imagined something like Mannering case would be sufficient to impress her. But I remember once I sat down again, feeling both angry and dejected, the thought came to me that I had not just only made an ass of myself with Miss Hemmings, but that I had perhaps been doing so continuously throughout the previous month, that my friends, for all their congratulations, had been laughing at me. By the following day, I had come to accept that I fully deserved the jolt that I had received. But this episode at the Waldorf probably did arouse in me feeling the resentment towards Miss Hemmings which I never fully shook off. and which undoubtedly contributed to yesterday's evening unfortunate events. At the time, though, I tried to see the whole incident as providential. It had, after all, brought home to me how easy it was to become distracted from one's cherished goals. My intention was to combat evil, in particular, evil of the insidious, furtive kind, and as such had little to do with courting popularity within society circles. I began thereafter to socialize far less and became more deeply immersed in my work. I studied notable cases from the past and absorbed new areas of knowledge that might one day prove useful. Around this time, too, I began scrutinizing the careers of various detectives who had established their names and found myself could discern a line between those reputations that had rested on a solid achievement and those that derive essentially from a position within some influential set. There I came to see a true and false way for a detective to gain renown. In short, much as I had been excited by the offers of friendships extended to me following the Mannering affair, I did, after that encounter at Waldorf, remember again the example set by my parents, and I resolved not to allow frivolous preoccupations to deflect me. One moment. That's the end of chapter 1. We are going to continue chapter 2. The end. Party finder. Is it up? It's okay. DNAFK. Oh wait. Oh, this too shit. It's okay. We'll be shameless today and do 2 party finder. Okay. We are currently reading When We Were Orphans by Kazuo Ishiguro. It's pretty interesting so far. All set in a period timepiece. Okay, my coffee's gone. Tea. It's cat hair on my microphone. Just give me a moment, please. God. Okay, pretty good. We are 1 hour into our reading and we finished. We are 1 hour into our reading and we finished chapter 1. It seems like first chapter is pretty, like 1 hour or something. Alright. We are currently reading Kazuo Ishiguro's When We Were Orphans, chapter 2. Since I am now recalling the period in my life following the Mannering case, it is perhaps worth mentioning here my unexpected reunion with Colonel Chamberlain after all those years. It is perhaps surprising given the role he had played at such a pivotal juncture in my childhood that we had not kept in closer contact. But for whatever reasons, we had failed to do so, and when I did meet him again, a month or two after the encounter with Miss Hemmings at Waldorf, it was quite by chance. Hello. Good morning, Magnus. Good morning. I was standing in a bookshop at the Charing Cross Road one rainy afternoon, examining an illustrated edition of Ivanhoe. I had been aware for some time of someone hovering close behind me and assuming he was wishing access to the part of the bookshelf and had moved aside. But then, when the person continued to loiter around me, I finally turned. I recognized the colonel immediately, for his physical features had hardly changed. However, through adult eyes, he appeared to be meeker and shabbier than the figure from my boyhood. He was standing there in a mackintosh, regarding me shyly, and only when I exclaimed, "Ah, Colonel!" did he smile and hold out his hand. "How are you, my boy? I was sure it was you. My goodness, how are you, my boy?" Although tears had appeared in his eyes, his manner remained awkward, as though he were afraid that I might be annoyed at this reminder of the past. I did my best to convey delight at seeing him again, and as the downpour commenced outside, we stood there exchanging conversation in the cramped bookshop. I discovered that he was still living in Worcestershire, that he had come to London to attend a funeral, and had decided to make a few days of it. When I asked where he was staying, he answered vaguely, leading me to suspect he had taken modest lodgings. Before parting, I invited him to dine with me the following evening, a suggestion that he took up with enthusiasm, though he seemed taken aback when I mentioned Dorchester. But I continued to insist. It is the least I can do after all your past kindness, I had pleaded, until he finally gave in. Looking back now, my choice of Dorchester strikes me as the height of inconsideration. I had, after all, surmised the colonel was short of funds. I should have seen too how wounding it would be for him to not pay at least his half of the bill. But in those days, such things never occurred to me. I was much too concerned, I suspect, about impressing the old man with the full extent of my transformation since he has last seen me. In this latter aim, I was probably rather successful, for as it happened, I had just around this point been taken to the Dorchester on 2 occasions, so that on the evening I met Colonel Chamberlain there, the sommelier greeted me with a nice to see you again, sir. And then, after he had witnessed me exchanging witticism with the maitre d' as we started on our soup, the colonel broke into sudden laughter. "And to think," he said, "this is the same little squirt I had snivelling at my side on the boat." He gave a few more laughs, and then broke off abruptly, perhaps fearing he should never have alluded to the subject. But I smiled calmly and said, "I must have been a trial to you on that trip, Colonel." The old man's face clouded for a moment, then he said solemnly, "Considering the circumstances, I thought you were extremely brave, my boy." "Extremely brave?" At this stage, I recall, there was a slightly awkward silence, which was broken when we both commented on the fine flavour of our soup. At the next table, a large lady with much jewelry was laughing gaily, and the colonel glanced rather indiscreetly towards her. He appeared to come to a decision. "You know, it's funny," he said. "I was thinking about it before I came out today. That time you and I first met. I wonder if you remember me, my boy. I don't suppose you do, after all. You had so much else on your mind then." On the contrary, I said, I have the most vivid memory of the occasion. This was no lie. Even now, if I were for a moment to close my eyes, I could at, I could with ease transport myself back to the bright morning in Shanghai and the office of Mr. Harold Anderson, my father's superior in the great trading company of Morgan Brook and Byatt. I was sitting in a chair that smelt of polished leather and oak, the sort of chair normally found behind some impressive desk, but which on this occasion had been pulled out into the center of the room. I could sense that it was a chair reserved for only the most important of personage on this occasion, owing to the gravity of the circumstances, or perhaps as a sort of consolation it had been given to me. I can remember that no matter how hard I tried, I could not find a dignified way to sit in it. In particular, I could discover no posture of which would enable me to keep both of my elbows at once upon its finely carved arms. Moreover, I had on that morning a brand new jacket made from some coarse grey material. Where it had come from, I do not know, but I was most self-conscious about the ugly way I had been made to button it almost to my chin. The room itself had tall grand ceilings, a large map on one wall, and behind Mr. Anderson's desk, great windows through which the sun was beating and breezing and a breeze blowing. I should think there were ceiling fans moving above me, though I do not actually remember this. What I do remember is that I was sitting in that chair in the middle of the room, the center of solemn concern and discussion. All around me, adults were conferring, most of them on their feet. Sometimes a few would drift over to the windows, their voices lowering as they argued at a point. I remember, too, being surprised by the way Mr. Anderson himself, a tall greying man with large moustache, behaved towards me, as we are good old friends. So much so that for a while I assumed we had known each other when I was younger, and that I had forgotten him. Only much later did I ascertain that we could not possibly have met until that morning. In any case, he had assumed for himself the role of uncle, continually smiling at me, patting my shoulder, nudging me and winking. Once he had offered me a cup of tea, saying, "Now, Christopher, this will cheer you up," and bent right down to peer at me as I had taken it. After that came more murmuring and conferring around the room. Then Mr. Anderson appeared in front of me again and then said, "So then, Christopher, it's all decided. This is Colonel Chamberlain. He's most kindly agreed to see you safe to England." I remember at this point a hush descending over the room. In fact, my impression was that all the adults shrank back until they were lining the walls like spectators. Mr. Anderson, too, withdrew with a final encouraging smile. It was then I first laid eyes on Colonel Chamberlain. He came up to me slowly, bent down to look into my face, and then held out his hand. I had a feeling I should stand up and shake it, but he had thrust it out so quickly that I had felt so fixed to that chair that I had grasped my hand still sitting. Then I remember him saying, "My poor lad, first your father, now your mother. Must feel like the whole world's collapsed around your ears. But we'll go to England tomorrow, just the two of us. Your aunt's waiting for you there, so be brave. You'll soon pick up the pieces again." For a moment, I was quite unable to find my voice. When I finally did so, I said, "It's awfully kind of you, sir. I'm very grateful for your offer, but I hope you don't think me very rude. If you don't mind, sir, I think I ought not to go to England just now." Then, when the colonel did not respond immediately, I went on. "Because you see, sir, the detectives are working extremely hard to find my mother and father, and they are the very best detectives in Shanghai, and I think that they are bound to find them very soon." The colonel was nodding. "I'm sure the authorities are doing everything possible. So you see, sir, Though I very much appreciate your kindness, I think my going to England it won't be necessary after all. I remember a murmur passing around the room at this point. The colonel went on nodding as though weighing things up carefully. You may be all right, my boy, he said eventually. I sincerely hope you are, but in any case, why don't you come with me anyway? Then, once your parents are found, they can send for you. Who knows? Perhaps they'll decide to come to England tomorrow. So what do you say? Let's you and me go to England tomorrow, then we wait and see what happens. But you see, sir, excuse me. But you see, the detectives are looking for my parents. They are the very best detectives. I'm not sure what exactly the colonel said to this. Perhaps he just went on nodding. In any case, the next moment he leaned even closer to me and placed a hand on my shoulder. Look here. I realize how it must feel. Entire worlds collapse on your ears. But you have to be brave. Besides, your aunt in England, she's expecting you, don't you see? Can't very well let the lady down at this stage, can we? When sitting over our soup that evening, I related to him my memory of these last words of his. I rather expected him to laugh. Instead, he said solemnly, I felt so sorry for you, my boy. So terribly sorry. Then, perhaps sensing he had misjudged my mood, he gave a short laugh and said more lightly, I remember waiting at the harbour with you. I kept saying, look here, we're going to have a lot of fun on ship, aren't we? On that ship, aren't we? We are going to have a jolly good time. And you just kept saying, yes sir, yes sir, yes sir. I allowed him for the next several minutes to drift through the reminiscence concerning various of his old acquaintances who had been present in Mr. Anderson's office that morning. Without exception, their names meant nothing to me. Then the colonel paused and a frown crossed his face. As for that Anderson himself, he said eventually, that chap always gave me an uneasy feeling. Something fishy about him. There was something fishy about the whole damn business, if you ask me. No sooner had he said this than he looked up at me with a start. Then, before I could respond, he began to talk again rapidly, moving us on to what he no doubt considered the safer territory of our voyage to England. Before long, he was chuckling to himself as he recounted memories of our fellow passengers in the ship's offices, amusing little incidents I had long forgotten and had not registered in the first place. He was enjoying himself, and I encouraged him to do so, often pretending to remember something just to please him. However, as he continued with this reminiscence, I found myself somewhat irritated. For gradually, from behind his cheerful anecdotes, there was a merging picture of myself on that voyage to which I took exception. His repeated insinuation was that I had gone about the ship withdrawn and moody, liable to burst into tears at the slightest thing. No doubt the colonel had an investment in giving himself the role of a heroic guardian, and after all this time I saw it was pointless, as it was unkind to contradict him. But as I say, I began to grow steadily more irritated, for according to my own quite clear memory, I adapted very ably to the changed realities of my circumstances. I remember very well that far from being miserable on that voyage, I was positively excited about the life aboard the ship, as well as by the prospect of the future that lay before me. Of course, I did miss my parents at times, but I can remember telling myself there would always be other adults I would come to love and trust. In fact, there were a number of ladies in the voyage that had heard about what happened to me, and for a time, came fussing around me with pitying expressions, and I can recall feeling much the same irritation with them as I did towards the colonel that evening at Dorchester. The fact was, I was not nearly as distressed as the adults around me seemed to suppose. As far as I can recall, there was only a single instance during the whole of the long voyage that I might conceivably have merited the title of snivelling little squirt, and even that occurred on the very first day of our journey. The sky, the morning was overcast. The water around us were very muddy. I was standing on the deck of the steamer gazing back towards the harbor, towards the messy shoreline of the boats, gangplanks, mud huts, dark wood jetties. Behind them, the large buildings of the Shanghai Bund, all now fading together into a single line blur. Well, lad, the colonel's voice had said near me. Think you'll be back again one day? Yes, sir, I expect I will. We'll see. Once you settle in England, I dare you'll forget all this quickly enough. Shanghai is not a bad place, but 8 years is about as much as I can take it. And I expect you have had about as much as you need. Much more, you'll be turning into a Chinaman. Yes, sir. Look here, old fellow. You really ought to cheer up. After all, you're going to England, you're going home. It was this last remark, this notion that I was going home, which caused my emotions to get the better of me. Get better of me, for I am certain of this, the first and the last time on that voyage. Even then, my tears were more of anger than sorrow, for I had deeply resented the colonel's words. As I saw it, I was bound for a strange land where I did not know a single soul, while this city steadily receding before me contained all I knew. Above all, my parents are still there, somewhere beyond the harbor, beyond the imposing skyline of the Bund, and wiping my eyes, I had cast my gaze towards the shore one last time, wondering if even now I might catch a sight of my mother, or even my father running onto the quay, waving and shouting for me to return. But I was conscious even then that such a hope was no more than just a childish indulgence. As I watched the city that had been my home grow less and less distinct, I remember turning to the colonel with a cheerful look and saying, "We should be reaching the sea fairly soon, don't you think so?" But I believed I managed to betray none of my irritation with the colonel that evening. Certainly, by the time he boarded the taxicab in South Atley Street and we said our goodbyes, he was in a splendid mood. It was only then I heard of his death, just over a year later, that I felt somewhat guilty. I had not been warmer towards him that evening at the Dorchester. He had, after all, once done me a good turn, and from all I had observed, had been a very decent man. But I suppose the role he had played in my life, the fact of his being so overwhelmingly associated with what had happened at that point, will ensure he remains forever an ambivalent figure in my memory. For at least 3 to 4 years after that Waldorf episode, Sarah Hemmings and I had little to do with one another. I remember seeing her once during the period at a cocktail party in a flat in Mayfair. The event was very crowded, but I did not know many of those there and had decided to leave early. I was making my way towards the door when I spotted Sarah Hemmings talking with someone standing directly in my path, and my first instinct was to turn and go the other way. But this was around the time of my success with the Roger Parker case, and it did occur to me to wonder if Miss Hemmings would still dare to be quite so high-handed as she had been at the Waldorf a few years earlier. I thus continued to squeeze my way past the guest and made sure to pass right in front of her. As I did so, I saw her gaze move to check over my features. A look of amusement crossed her face and she struggled to remember who I was. Then I saw recognition drawn, and without a nod, she turned her gaze back to the person to whom she was talking. But I hardly gave such an incident any thought, for it came during a period when I was deeply engrossed in many challenging cases, and although this was still a good year before my name acquired anything of the standing as it has today, I was already beginning to appreciate for the first time the scale of responsibility that befalls a detective with any sort of renown. I had always understood, of course, that the task of rooting out evil in its most devious forms, often just when it is about to go unchecked, is crucial and a solemn undertaking. But it was not until my experience with such cases as the Roger Parker murder that it came home to me just how much it means to people, and not only those directly concerned, but the public at large, to be cleansed of such encroaching wickedness. As a result, I became more determined than ever not to be diverted by the more superficial priorities of London life, and I began to understand perhaps something of what had made it possible for my parents to take the stand they had. In any case, the likes of Sarah Hemmings did not much impinge on my thought during that time, and it is even possible I would have forgotten her existence altogether had I not run into Joseph Turner that day in Kensington Gardens. I was at the time investigating a case at Norfolk and had returned to London for a few days with the intention of studying the extensive notes that I had made. It was while I was strolling around Kensington Gardens one grey morning, pondering the many curious details surrounding the victim's disappearance, that I hailed from afar by a figure I quickly recognized to be Turner, a man that I had come to know vaguely from my social rounds. He came hurrying up to me, and after asking why I was so rarely seen about the place these days, invited me to a dinner he and a friend were giving in a restaurant that evening. When I politely declined on the grounds that my present case was demanding all my time and attention, he said, "Shame. Sarah Hemmings is coming along, and she's so wanting to have a good chat with you." "Miss Hemmings?" I said. "Remember her, don't you?" "She certainly remembers you. Said that you got to know each other a few years ago, and she's always complaining how you are no longer to be found." Resisting to the urge to make some comment, I simply said, "Well, please do give her my good wishes." I left Turner fairly promptly after that, but on returning to my desk, I confess I found myself somewhat distracted by this report of Miss Hemmings wishing to see me. In the end, I told myself that in all likelihood Turner had made some mistake, or at least was exaggerating his point in an effort to entice me to his dinner. But then, over the following months, a number of similar reports reached my ears. Sarah Hemmings had been heard expressing annoyance at how, despite our once having been friends, I have now become impossible for her to find. I heard from several sources, moreover, how she was threatening to ferret me out. Then finally, last week, while I was staying in the village of Shacton in Oxfordshire to investigate the Studley Grange business, Miss Hemmings turned up in person, presumably with the intention of doing just that. 1 second for tea. I had found the walled garden containing the pond where Charles Emery's body had been discovered in the lower grounds of the house. 4 stone steps had brought me down into a rectangular space so perversely sheltered from the sun that even on the bright morning, everything around me was in shadow. The walls themselves were covered with ivy, but somehow one could not avoid the impression of having stepped into a roofless prison cell. The pond dominated this enclosure. Though several people had told me that it had contained goldfish, I could not see no signs of life. In fact, it was hard to imagine how anything could thrive in such dank water. A fitting place indeed to discover a corpse. Surrounding the pond was a circle of square mossy slabs embedded into the mud. I would suppose I had been examining this area for about 20 minutes. I was on my front, scrutinizing with my magnifying glass one slab that projected over the water, when I became conscious of someone observing me. At first I assumed this to be some family member wishing yet again to pester me with questions. Since earlier I had insisted on uninterrupted time, I decided at the cost of appearing rude, to pretend not to have noticed anything. Then eventually I hear the sound of a shoe scraping on stone somewhere near the entrance of the garden. By then it was starting to seem unnatural that I should remain on my belly for such a long time, and in any case I had exhausted the investigations I could usefully carry in such a posture. Moreover, I had not entirely forgotten I was lying at I was lying at almost the exact spot where a murder had been committed, and that the murderer was still at large. A chilly sensation passed through me as I clambered to my feet, dusting my clothes, and turned to face the intruder. The sight of Sarah Hemmings did, of course, rather surprise me, but I am sure nothing unusual showed on my face. I had set my features to convey annoyance, and I would suppose that is what she saw, for her opening words to me were, "Oh, didn't mean to spy on you. But it seemed too good an opportunity to watch the great man at his work, I mean." I searched for her face carefully, but I could detect no sarcasm. Nevertheless, I kept my voice cold and I said, "Miss Hemmings, this is most unexpected. I heard you were here. I'm spending a few days with my friends in Pemley, but it's only just up the road." She paused, no doubt expecting me to respond. When I remained silent, she showed no sign of being perturbed, but instead came walking towards me. "Yeah, I'm quite good friends of the Emerys, do you know?" she continued. "Awful business, this murder." "Yes, awful." "Ah, so you too believe it to be a murder? Well, I suppose that sort of clinches it. Do you have a theory, Mr. Banks?" I gave a shrug. "I've formed a few ideas, yes." "It's too bad for the Emerys. They didn't think to ask you for help when it first happened last April. I mean, bringing in Calvin Henderson onto a case like this. What did they expect? The man should have been put out to pasture long ago. Just shows you how out of touch people get living out here. Anyone in London could have told them all about you, of course." This last remark did, I have to confess, intrigue me somewhat. So after that moment's hesitation, I found myself asking her, "Excuse me, but told them what exactly?" "Why, that you're the most brilliant investigative mind in England, of course. We could have all told them that last spring, but the Emerys, it's taken them this long to cotton on. Better late than never, perhaps, but I suppose the trail's gone rather cold for you by now. As it happens, there are some advantages in coming to a case after some time has elapsed." "Really? How fascinating. I always thought it was essential to get there quick, to pick up a scent, you know." "On the contrary, it's never too late, as you put it, to pick up a scent." "But isn't it so depressing how this crime's eaten away at people's spirits here? And not just the household. It's the whole of Shacton that's started to rot. This used to be a happy, thriving market town. Now look at them. They barely meet each other's eyes. The whole business has dragged them down into a mire of suspicion. I tell you, Mr. Banks, if you can solve this thing, they'll remember you here forever." "Do you really think so? That would be curious." "No doubt about it. They will be so grateful. Yes, they'll be talking about you here for generations." I let out a short laugh. "You seem to know all the village well, Miss Hemmings, and I thought you spent all your time in London." "Oh, I can only take so much of London. Then I've just got to come away. I'm not a city girl at heart, you know." You surprise me. I always thought you were much drawn to the city life." "You're quite right, Mr. Banks." A note of resentment had come into her voice, as though I had tricked her into a corner. "Sometimes something does draw me to the city. It does have its attractions for me." For the first time, she turned away from me and glanced around the walled garden. "Which reminds me," she said, "well, to be honest, it doesn't remind me at all. Why should I pretend? I've been thinking of it all the time we have been talking. I wanted to ask a favor of you." "And what's that, Miss Hemmings?" "Reliable sources tell me that you have been invited to this year's Meredith Foundation dinner. Is that right?" I paused slightly before replying. "Yes, that is correct." "Quite a thing to be invited at your age. I've heard this year it is in honor of Sir Cecil Mathers." "I believe so." "I heard too that Charles Wolfe is to be expected to attend." "The violinist?" She laughed brightly. Does he do something else? And Thomas Byron too, apparently. She had become visibly excited, but now she has once again turned away and gazed at our surroundings with a slight shudder. Did you say, I eventually asked, you wish to grant you a favor? You wish me to grant you a favor? Oh, yes, yes. I wanted to. I wish to ask you. Oh, wait. I wanted you to. I wish you to ask me to accompany you to the Meredith Foundation dinner. She was now holding me with an intense look. It took me a moment to find a response, but when I did so, I spoke quite calmly. I would like to oblige you, Miss Hemmings, but unfortunately, I've already replied to the organizers some days ago. I fear it will be rather late to inform them of my wish to bring a guest. Nonsense! She broke in angrily. Yours is the name on everyone's lips just now. If you wish to bring a companion, they'll be only too pleased. Mr. Banks, you aren't about to let me down, aren't you? That would be quite unworthy of you, after all. We have been good friends for some time now. It was this last remark, reminding me as it did of the actual history of our friendship, that brought me back to myself. Miss Hemmings, I said with finality, this is hardly a favor within my power to grant. But there was now a determined look in Sarah Hemmings' eyes. And no other details, Mr. Banks. At Claridge Hotel, next Wednesday evening. I mean to be there. I shall look forward to the evening, and I shall be waiting for you in the lobby. The lobby of Claridge is, as far as I am aware, open to respectable members of the public. If you choose to stand there the next Wednesday evening, there's nothing I can do to prevent you, Miss Hemmings. She looked at me very carefully, now uncertain about my intentions. Finally she said, Then you shall most certainly see me there next Wednesday, Mr. Banks. As I've said, that is your affair, Miss Hemmings. Now, if you'll excuse me. We are on chapter 3. A moment please for tea. It took no more than a few days to unravel the mystery of Charles Emery's death. The matter did not attract publicity on the scale of some of my other investigations, but the deep gratitude of the Emery family, indeed of the whole community of Shacton, made the case as satisfying as any thus far in my career. I returned to London in a glow of well-being, and consequently failed to give much thought to my encounter with Sarah Hemmings in the walled garden on that first day of the investigation. I would not say I forgot entirely her declared intentions regarding the Meredith Foundation that dinner, but as I say, I was in a triumphant frame of mind, and I suppose I chose not to dwell on such things. Perhaps, deep down, I believe her threat to have been no more than a ploy of the moment. In any case, when I stepped out from a taxicab outside Claridge yesterday evening, my thoughts were elsewhere. I was, for one thing, reminding myself that my recent triumph had more than entitled me to my invitation, that far from questioning my presence at such a gathering, other guests were likely to press me eagerly for inside information regarding my cases. I was reminding myself, too, of my resolution not to leave the proceedings prematurely, even if it meant putting up with the odd period of standing about alone. As I entered the grand lobby there, I was quite unprepared for the sight of Sarah Hemmings waiting there with a smile. She was dressed rather impressively in a dark silk dress and discreet but elegant jewelry. Her manner as she came towards me was utterly assured, so much that she even found time to smile a greeting to a couple walking past us. Ah, Miss Hemmings, I said, While in my mind, I tried to hurriedly retrieve all that had passed between us that day at the Studley Grange. Thank you. Tea. At that moment, I must confess, it seemed to me perfectly possible that she had every right to expect me to offer my arm and lead her inside. No doubt, she sensed my uncertainty and appeared to grow even more confident. "Dear Christopher," she said, "you are looking quite dashing. I'm overcome. Oh, and I haven't had a chance to congratulate you. That was so marvelous what you did for Emery's. It was ever so clever of you." "Thank you. It was hardly such a complicated matter." She had now taken my arm and she at that instant moved towards the footman directing dinner guests towards the staircase. I am sure I would have been powerless to do anything other than her bidding. But here, I see now, she made an error. Perhaps she wished to savor the moment. Perhaps her audacity had for a second given out. In any case, she made no move to proceed upstairs, but instead, gazing at other guests filing into the lobby, said to me, "Sir Cecil hasn't arrived yet. I do hope I shall get a chance to speak to him. So fitting he's the one being honored this year, don't you think?" "Indeed. You know, Christopher, I don't suppose it will be so many years until we're all here to honor you." I laughed. "I hardly think." "No, no. I feel so sure of it. All right, we might have to give it a few more years, but the day will come, you see." It's kind of you to say so, Miss Hemmings." She continued to hold my arms as we stood there talking. Not infrequently someone passing would smile or utter a greeting to one or the other of us, and I have to say, I found myself rather enjoying the notion of all these people, many of them very distinguished, seeing me arm in arm with Sarah Hemmings. I fancied I saw in their eyes, even as they greeted us, the idea, "Oh, she's caught him, has she?" Well, that's natural enough, far from making me feel foolish or in any humiliating way. Thank you for joining. Humiliated, this notion filled me with pride. But then suddenly, and I'm not sure what caused this, quite without warning I began to feel a great fury towards her. I'm sure there was no detectable change in my manner at the moment. For a few minutes more we went on chatting amiably, nodding the occasional greetings to passing guests. But when I unlinked her arm from mine and turned to her, I did so with steely resolve. "Well, Miss Hemmings, it was very good to see you again, but now I must leave you and go up to this function." I gave a slight bow and began to move away. This clearly took her by surprise, and if she had already some strategy for my failing to cooperate, she was for the moment unable to act on it. Only when I had gone several paces from her, and had in fact fallen in step with an elderly couple who had greeted me, did she suddenly came rushing up. "Christopher!" she said in a frantic whisper. "You wouldn't dare! You promised me!" "You know I did nothing of the sort." "You wouldn't dare! Christopher, you wouldn't!" "I wish you a pleasant evening, Miss Hemmings." Turning away from her, and also incidentally from my elderly companions, who were doing their best to hear nothing, I began to make my way rapidly up the great staircase. On reaching the upper level, I was ushered into a brightly lit anteroom. There, I duly joined a line of guests filing past a desk, behind which sat a uniformed man with frosty face, checking people's names against a register, and when it came to my turn, I was gratified to see a flicker of excitement across the frosty man's face as he ticked off my name. I signed the guest book, then moved towards the doorway leading into a large room, within which I could see there was already a sizable crowd of guests. As I crossed the threshold and hubbub engulfed me, a tall man with thick dark beard greeted me and shook my hand. I suppose he was one of the evening hosts, but I failed to register much of what he said to me because, to be frank, I was at the moment finding it hard to think about anything other than what had just occurred downstairs. I was experiencing a curiously hollow sensation, and I had to remind myself that I had not in any way ensnared Miss Hemmings, that any humiliation that had befallen her was entirely her own making. But as I parted from the bearded man and drifted further into the room, Sarah Hemmings continued to dominate my thoughts. I was vaguely aware of the waiter approaching me with a tray of aperitifs, of various people turning to greet me. At some point, I fell into conversation with a group of 3 or 4 men, all of whom turned out to be scientists, and who seemed to know who I am. Then, when I had been in the room for perhaps 15 minutes, I sensed a slight change in the atmosphere, and looking about me, perceived from the glances and murmurs all around that some sort of commotion was occurring near the doorway through which we had entered. No sooner had I noticed this than a sense of grave foreboding came over me, and my first impulse was to escape deeper into the room. But it was as though some mysterious force were pulling me back to the doorway, and I soon found myself once more beside the bearded man, who at that moment was standing with his back towards the reception, watching with a pained expression the drama unfolding in the anteroom. Peering past him, I ascertained that Miss Hemmings was indeed at the heart of the disturbance. She had brought to a halt the procession of guests signing in their names at the desk. She was not shouting exactly, but seemed quite beyond caring who heard her. I watched her shake off an elderly hotel employee to restrain her, then leaning right over the desk as to glare all the more intently at the frosty-faced man who's still sitting there before. She said in a voice close to a sob, "But you simply have no idea. I must go in, don't you see? I have so many friends in there. I belong in there. I really do. Oh, do be reasonable." "I am really sorry, miss," the frosty-faced man began. But then Sarah Hemmings, whose hair had tumbled over one side of her face, did not let him finish. "It's all the most silly mixed up anyway, don't you see? That's all that is. It's the most silly all mixed up. And just because of that you're being beastly. I can't believe it. I just can't believe it." All of us, witnessing this scene, seemed for a moment united in frozen embarrassment. Then the bearded man again regained his wits and strode into the anteroom with authority. "What has occurred?" he said soothingly. "My dear young lady, has there been an error? There, we'll sort it out, I'm sure. I'm at your disposal." Then he gave a start and exclaimed, "Why, it's Miss Hemmings, isn't it? Of course it is. It's me, don't you see? This man's being so beastly to me." "But Miss Hemmings, my dear young lady, there's no need to upset yourself like this. Come, let's go over here for a moment." "No, no! You won't turn me away. I won't have it. I tell you I must. I absolutely must go in. I dreamt of it for so long." "Surely something can be done for the young lady," a man's voice said from among the bystanders. "Why be so petty? If she's taken the trouble to come here, why can't she be allowed in?" This produced a general murmur of assent, though I noticed too some faces set in disapproval. The bearded man hesitated, then appeared to decide that his priority was to bring the scene to an end. "Well, perhaps, in this particular case," then turning to the frosty-faced man behind the desk, he went on, "I'm sure we can find a way to accommodate Miss Hemmings, don't you think, Mr. Edwards?" I would have lingered further, but throughout this exchange I had been seized by the fear that at any stage Miss Hemmings might notice me and draw me into this unseemly spectacle with an accusation. In fact, just as I began to retreat, she did for 1 second gaze straight at me. But she did nothing. The next moment her anguished eyes were back on the bearded man. I took my opportunity to hurry away. For the next 20 minutes or so I confined myself to those areas of the ballroom furthest from the doorway. A surprising number of those present appeared needlessly and overawed by the occasion, so much so that most of the conversations, those I could hear around me as well as those I took part in, consisted almost entirely of mutual compliments. Once the compliments had been exhausted, people would resort to eulogizing the guest of honor. At one stage, after one such speech listing exhaustively Sir Cecil's Methur's achievements, I said to the elderly man who had just made it, "I wonder if Sir Cecil has arrived yet." My companion indicated with his glass, and I saw a little way across the room that the tall figure of a great statesman stood in conversation with two middle-aged ladies. Then, just as I was looking over at him, I saw Sarah Hemmings emerge through the crowd, making straight for him. There was no trace of the pitiful creature from the anteroom. She looked positively radiant. As I watched, she strode right up to Sir Cecil with no hint of hesitation and laid his hand on his arm. The elderly man began to introduce me to someone, so that I was obliged for a moment to turn away. When I next looked towards Sir Cecil, I saw the two middle-aged ladies were standing to one side, looking on with awkward smiles that Miss Hemmings had succeeded in engaging his complete attention. Even as I watched, Sir Cecil leaned back his head to laugh aloud at something she was saying. In the meantime, we were ushered into a banqueting hall and seated around a vast, long table under the bright chandeliers. I was relieved to find Miss Hemmings had been seated some away from me, and for a while I did enjoy the occasional. I did rather enjoy the occasion. I chatted in turn to the ladies sitting on either side of me, both of whom, in their different ways, were quite charming, and the food was pleasantly sumptuous. But as the meal went on, I found myself leaning forward time again to catch sight of Miss Hemmings further down the table, and I began yet again to rehearse in my head all the reasons why I had been entitled to behave as I did. It is perhaps owing to such preoccupations that I cannot now remember much more concerning the dinner itself. Somewhere towards the end there was speeches. Various persons stood up to heap praise on Sir Cecil for his contributions to worldly affairs, and in particular for his role in building the League of Nations. Then finally Sir Cecil himself rose to his feet. His speech, as I recall it, was self-deprecating and optimistic. In his view, mankind had learned from its mistake, and structure were now firmly in place to ensure we would never again see on this globe a calamity on the scale of a great war. The war, ghastly as it sounded, represented no more than an awkward window in a man's evolution. When for a few years our technical progress had run ahead of our organizational capacities, we had all surprised ourselves with the rapid development of our engineering might and the consequent ability to wage war with modern weaponry. But now we had made good the gap, having been reminded of the horrors that could be let loose among us. The forces of civilization had prevailed and legislated. His speech was along some such line, and we did applaud it heartily. After dinner, the ladies did not leave us, but instead they were all asked to proceed into the ballroom. There we found a string quartet, the waiter moving about the trays and liquors, cigars and coffee. The guests began immediately to circulate, and the atmosphere was far more relaxed than before the dinner. At one point, I happened to catch Miss Hemmings' eyes across the room, and was surprised to see her smile at me. My initial thought was that this was the smile of an enemy plotting some awful revenge, but then I continued to observe her as the evening went on, and decided that I was wrong about this. I realized that Sarah Hemmings was utterly happy. After months, perhaps years of planning, she had succeeded in being at this place at this time, and having achieved her goals, she had, much like, so we are told, a woman who had just given birth, consigned to all oblivion of all memories of the pain she had endured along the way. I watched her drifting from group to group, chatting amiably. It occurred to me that I should go over and make peace with her while her mood lasted. But then The possibility of her suddenly turning and creating another scene kept me a good distance from her. It was perhaps half an hour into this portion of the evening when I finally introduced to Sir Cecil matters that I had been making no special efforts to meet him, but I suppose I might have been a little disappointed had I left the occasion without having exchanged any words with the illustrious statesman. As it was he who was led up to me by Lady Adams, who I had met several months ago during an investigation. Sir Cecil grasped my hand warmly and saying, "Ah, my young friend, so here you are." For a few minutes we were left alone together in the middle of the room. All around us by this time there was a lively hubbub, and when we exchanged our usual pleasantries, we were obliged to lean towards another and raise our voices. At one point he nudged at me and said, "All of that I was saying earlier that at dinner about this world being made safer, more civilized, I do believe it, you know. At least," he grasped my hand and gave me a droll look, "at least I would like to believe it. Oh yes, I would dearly love to believe it, but I don't know, my young friend. I don't know if in the end we'll be able to hold the line. We'll do what we can, organize, confer, get the greatest men from the greatest nation to put their heads together and talk. But there will always be evil lurking around the corner of us. Oh yes, they are busy, even now, even as we are speaking, busy conspiring to put civilization to the torch. And they are clever, oh, devilishly clever. And good men and women can do what they can, devote their lives to keeping them at bay. But I fear it won't be enough, my friend. I fear it won't be enough. The evil ones are much too cunning for your ordinary decent citizens. They run rings around him, corrupt him, and hunt him, and sorry, and turn him against his fellow. I see it. I see it all the time now, and it will grow worse. That's why we need to rely more than ever on the likes of you, my young friend. The few on our side, every bit as clever as they are, who will spot their game quickly, destroy the fungus before it takes hold and spreads." Possibly he was more than a little drunk. Possibly the occasion has overwhelmed him. In any case, he went on this vein for some time, clasping on my arm emotionally as he spoke, and perhaps simply because this distinguished man was being so effusive, or perhaps it was that I had in my mind all evening to ask him some such thing, and when at last he came to a halt, I said to him, "Sir Cecil, I believe you have spent some time recently in Shanghai." "Shanghai? Certainly, my friend. Been back and forth. What happens in China is crucial. We can no longer look just at Europe, you see. If we wish to contain chaos in the Europe, we now have to look further afield." Hey, morning, Swiss roll. Afternoon, sorry. Thank you. I needed tea. How you doing? I ask, sir, because I was born in Shanghai. Is that so? Well, well. I did just wonder, sir, if you come across an old friend of mine there. Of course, there's no real person why you would have done, but his name is Yamashita. Akira Yamashita. Yamashita? Japanese, I take it. A lot of Japanese in Shanghai, of course. They have more influence there by the day. Yamashita, you said. Akira Yamashita. Can't say I came across him. Diplomatist or something? Actually, sir, I wouldn't know. He was a childhood friend. Oh, I see. In that case, do you know for sure he's still in Shanghai? Perhaps your man has left and gone back to Japan. Oh no. Oh no. I'm sure he's still there. Akira was very fond of Shanghai. Besides, he was determined never to return to Japan, so I'm sure he'll still be there. Well, I didn't come across him. Saw quite a lot of that chap Saito and a few of the military fellows, but none of them by that name. Well, I gave a laugh to cover my disappointment. It was always unlikely, but I just did wonder. Just at this moment, somewhat to my alarm, I realized Sarah Hemmings was standing beside me. So, you have finally cornered the great detective, Sir Cecil, she said cheerily. Indeed, my dear, said the old gentleman. The old gentleman replied, beaming at her. I was just telling him how we have all have to depend on him in the years to come. Sarah Hemmings smiled at me. I have to say, Sir Cecil, I haven't found I haven't always found Mr. Banks to be utterly dependable, but perhaps he's the best that we can do. I decided at this juncture that I should leave as quickly as possible, and pretending to notice someone across the room, I made my apologies and moved away. I did not set my eyes on Miss Hemmings again until some time later. By then, many of the guests had started to leave and the ballroom was less stuffy. Moreover, the waiters had opened a number of doors on the balcony so that a refreshing night breeze was blowing across the room. For all that, the evening had remained warm, and wishing for a little air, I drifted over to one of the balconies. I had all but stepped out onto it before I realized Sarah Hemmings was already standing there, her back to the room, a cigarette in her holder, gazing out at the night sky. I started back, but then something told me, despite her not having stirred, that she had become aware of my presence. I thus made my way to the balcony and said, So, Miss Hemmings, you have had your evening after all? It's been the most marvelous evening, she said without turning. She gave a contented sigh, drew on a cigarette, then gave me one quick smile over her shoulder before turning her gaze back to the night sky. It's exactly as I imagined it would be. All these marvelous people everywhere. You care to glance, marvelous people. And Sir Cecil, he's such a darling, don't you think? I had the most wonderful talk with Eric Mitchell about his exhibition. He's going to invite me to the private view next month. I said nothing to this, and for a few moments we continued simply to stand there, side by side against the balcony rail. Curiously, perhaps it was to do with the string quartet whose gentle waltz was drifting out to us. The silence was not uncomfortable as one might have expected. Eventually she said, I suppose you surprised me. Surprised? At how determined I was. Oh, sorry. I suppose you are surprised at me. Surprised? At how determined I was to get in here tonight. I was surprised, yes. Then I said, Why do you suppose it is, Miss Hemmings, that you should find it so imperative to seek out company at this, such as this tonight? Imperative? You believe I find it imperative? I would say so. And what I witnessed at the door earlier on might tend to support that view. Rather to my surprise, she responded with a light laugh and gave me a smile. But why shouldn't I, Christopher? Why shouldn't I wish to be in company like this? Isn't it simply heaven? When I remained silent, her smile faded. I suppose you rather disapprove of me, she said in a quite different voice. I merely remarked, It's all right. You are every right. You find all that earlier on. You find it embarrassing and you disapprove. But what else am I to do? I don't wish to look back at my life when I'm old and I see empty. I want to see something I can be proud of, you see. Christopher, I am ambitious. I'm not quite sure I understand you. You are under the impression that you'll lead more worthwhile life if you consort with famous people? Is that really how you see me? She turned away, perhaps genuinely hurt, and drew again on her cigarette. I watched her staring at the deserted street below and at the white stucco-fronted buildings opposite. Then she said quietly, I can see it might look that way, at least to someone observing me with cynical eye. I hope I don't observe you that way. It would upset me to think I did so. Then you should try to be more understanding, she said to me with an intent expression before looking away again. If my parents were alive today, she said, they'll be telling me it's high time I was married. And perhaps it is, but I won't do what I have seen so many girls do. I won't waste all my love, all my energy, all my intellect, modest as that is, on some useless man who devotes himself to golf or selling bonds in the city. When I marry, it will be someone who will really contribute. I mean, to humanity, to a better world. Is that such an awful ambition? I don't come to places like this in search of famous men, Christopher. I came in search of distinguished ones. What do I care about a little embarrassment here and there? She waved towards the room. But I won't accept it's my fate to waste my life on some pleasant, polite, morally worthless man. When you put it like that, I said, I can see how you might see yourself as well, almost a zealot. In a way, Christopher, I do. Oh, but what's that piece they were playing now? It's something I know. Is it Mozart? I believe it's Haydn. Oh yes, you're right, it's Haydn. For several seconds she looked at the sky and appeared to be listening. Miss Hemmings, I said eventually, I'm not proud of the way I behaved towards you earlier. In fact, I now very much regret it. I am sorry. I hope you forgive me. She went on looking out at the night, stroking her cheek lightly with her cigarette holder. That's very decent of you, Christopher, she said quietly. But I should be the one to apologize. I was just trying to use you after all. Of course I was. I am sure I made myself look dreadful earlier on, but I don't care about that. I do care though, that I treated you badly. Perhaps you won't believe me, but it's true. I laughed. Well then, let's both try and forgive each other. Yes, let's. She turned to me and her face suddenly broke into a smile that was almost like a childlike in its glee. Then a weariness fell over it once more and she turned back to the night. I often treat people badly, she said. I suppose that comes with being ambitious and not having so much time left. Did you lose your parents long ago? I asked. It seems like forever, but in another way, they are always with me. Well, I'm glad you enjoyed your evening. After all, I can only say I am sorry for my own part in it. Oh, look, everyone's leaving. What a pity. And I always wanted to talk to you about all kinds of things. About your friend, for instance. My friend? The friend you were asking Sir Cecile about. The one in Shanghai. Akira? He was just an old friend. But I could tell he was someone very important to you. I straightened and looked behind us. You're right, everyone is leaving. Then I suppose I should leave too, she said. Otherwise my departure will be much noticed as my entrance. But she made no move to go, and in the end it was I who excused myself and went back into the room. At one point, when I glanced back, I thought she cut a lonely figure at the balcony, smoking her cigarette into the night air, the room behind her fast emptying, and it even ran through my mind I should go back and offer to escort her out of the proceedings. But then, her mentioning Akira had slightly alarmed me, and I decided I had done sufficient for one evening towards improving relations between myself and Sarah Hemmings. Let me see. The next few chapters are all very... The next chapter is like insanely long. Let me see. Chapter 7. They go by parts, so I think I can read a couple more chapters, I suppose. Sorry, give me a moment, okay? I'm trying to like sort out the chapters and see how much I can. Don't cry. I'm not crying. What? I'm not Who said I'm crying? So many chapters. Trying to. Well, initially I wanted to go by parts, but the next part is like insanely long, and I don't really want to read until I lost my voice. So I'm trying to like divide everything into like it's each chapter now. 20. There's a lot of chapter 22, 23. Okay, where am I now? Okay, part 2. Okay, let me see. Okay. Huh. How do I do this? I can read about 2 more chapters, I would say. Yeah, I'll read 2 more chapters. Okay, we are going into part 2 of When We Were Orphan. Okay. Tea, 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 tea. Can I eat a slice of bread? It's like cold. Ah. Yeah, a quiet day, morning. Hmm. Sorry, I'm taking a short break. Oh, at 5 p.m. I won't read until 5 p.m. Don't worry. Sorry, I had to eat something. Okay. Part 2. When we were orphan. London, 15th of May, 1931. Chapter 4. At the rear of our garden in Shanghai, there was a grass mound with a single maple tree rising out of its summit. From the time Akira and I were around 6 years old, we enjoyed playing on and around that mound. And whenever I now think of my boyhood companion, I tend to remember the two of us running up and down its slope, sometimes jumping right off where the sides were at their steepest. From time to time, when we had worn ourselves out, we would sit panting at the top of the mound with our backs against the trunk of the maple tree. From this vantage point, we had a clear view over my garden and of the big white house standing at the end of it. If I close my eyes a moment, I'm able to bring back the picture very vividly. The carefully tended English lawn, the afternoon shadows cast by the row of elms separating my garden and Akira's, the house itself, a huge white edifice with numerous wings and trellised balconies. I suspect this memory of the house is very much a child's version, and that in reality it was nothing so grand. Certainly, even at the time, I was conscious that it hardly matched the splendor of the residences around the corner in the Bubbling Well Road, but the house was certainly more than adequate for a household comprising simply my parents, myself, Mei Li, and our servants. It was the property of Morgan, Brooke, and Bryant, which meant there were many ornaments and pictures around the place I was forbidden to touch. It meant also from time to time we would have boarding with us a house guest, some employee newly arrived in Shanghai, who has yet to find his feet. I do not know if my parents objected to this arrangement. I did not mind at all, since usually a house guest would be some young man who brought with him an air of English lanes and meadows that I knew from the winds of the willows, or else the foggy streets of Conan Doyle mysteries. These young Englishmen, no doubt eager to create a good impression, were inclined to indulge my lengthy questions and sometimes unreasonable requests. Most of them, it occurs to me, were probably younger than I am today, and were probably all at sea so far away from their home. But to me at that time, they were all of them figures to study closely and emulate. But to return to Akira, there is a particular instance that now comes to mind from one such afternoon after the two of us had been running frantically up and down the mound to enact one of our extended dramas. We were for a moment sitting down against the maple tree to recover our breath, and I was gazing across the lawn towards the house, waiting for my chest to stop heaving when Akira said behind me, "Be careful, old chip! Centipede! By your food!" I clearly heard him say "old chip," but did not at this point think anything of it. But having once used the phrase, Akira seems rather pleased with it, and over the following several minutes, once I resumed our game, proceeding to address me over and over, "This way, old chip! More fast, old chip!" "Anyways, it's not old chip," I told him in the end. During one of our disputes over how our game should proceed. "It is old chap." Akira, as I knew he would, protested vigorously. "Not at all, not at all. Mrs. Brown, she makes me say again and again, 'Old chip, old chip.' Correct pronunciation, everything. She says 'old chip.' She teacher." It was pointless to try to convince him. Since starting his English lessons, he was immensely proud of his position within his family as the expert English speaker. All the same, I was unwilling to concede the point, and in the end, the quarrel grew to such proportions Akira simply stalked off in fury, our game abandoned through our secret door, a gap in the hedge separating two gardens.
On the next few occasions we played together, he did not call me old chip or make any reference to this altercation on the mound. I had all but forgotten the matter when one morning was a few weeks later. It came up again suddenly as we were walking together along the bubbling well road, past the grand houses and beautiful lawns. I cannot remember quite what I had just said to him. In any case, he responded by saying, "Very kind of you, old chap." Is it tomorrow or today? That's kind of weird. I remember resisting the temptation to point out that he had come round to my view, for by then I knew Akira well enough to realize he was not saying old chap by a way of subtle admission that he had previously been wrong. Rather, in some odd way, we both understood that he was implying that he had always been the one to claim it was old chap, that he is now merely reasserting his argument, and let my lack of protest simply confirm his conclusive victory. Indeed, for the rest of the afternoon, he continued to old chap me with an ever more smug expression, as if to say, "You're no longer determined to be ridiculous. I'm glad you're seeing more sense." This kind of behavior was not at all untypical of Akira, and though I always found it infuriating, but for some reason I rarely made the effort to protest. In fact, and today I find this hard to explain, I felt a certain need to preserve such fantasies on Akira's behalf, and had say an adult tried to arbitrate in the old chip dispute, I would just as likely to have taken Akira's side. I do not wish to imply by this that Akira dominated me, or that ours was in any sense of unbalanced friendship. I took as much initiative in our games, and if anything, made more of the crucial decisions. The fact was, I believed myself his intellectual superior, and at some level, Akira probably accepted this. On the other hand, there were various things that gave my Japanese friend great authority in my eyes. They were, for instance, his arm lock, which he often administered if I made statement that displeased him, or if during one of our dramas I became resistant to dropping a particular plot turn that he was keen on. More generally, even though he was actually only a month of my senior, I did have a sense that he was the more worldly. He did seem to know about many things I did not. There was, above all, his claim to have ventured on several occasions beyond the boundaries of the settlement. It is slightly surprising to me, looking back, to think how, as young boys, we were allowed to come up and go unsupervised to the extent that we were. But this was, of course, all within the relative safety of the international settlement. I, for one, was forbidden to enter the Chinese area of the city, and as far as I know, Akira's parents were no less strict on this matter. Out there, we were told, lay all manner of ghastly diseases, filth and evil men. The closest I had ever come out of going out of the settlement was once when a carriage carrying my mother and me took an unexpected route along the path of the Suchou Creek, bordering the Chapei district. I could see the huddled low rooftops across the canal, and I had held my breath for as long as I could, for fear of the pestilence that would come airborne across the narrow strip of water. No wonder then that my friends claimed to have undertaken a number of secret forays into such areas made an impression on me. I remember quizzing Akira repeatedly about these exploits. The truth concerning the Chinese districts, he told me, was far worse even than rumors. There were no proper buildings, just shack upon shacks built in great proximity to one another. It all looked, he claimed, much like a marketplace in Boone Road, except for the whole families were to be found living in each stall. There were, moreover, dead bodies piled up everywhere, flies buzzing all over them, and no one there thought anything on it. On one occasion, Akira had been strolling down a crowded alley and had seen a man some powerful warlord, he supposed, being transported on a sedan chair accompanied by a giant carrying sword. The warlord was pointing to whomever he pleased, and the giant would then proceed to lop his or her head off. Naturally, people were trying to hide themselves the best they could. Akira, though, had simply stood there staring defiantly back at the warlord. The latter had spent a moment considering whether to have Akira beheaded, but then, obviously struck by my friend's courage, had finally laughed and reaching down patted him on the head. Then the warlord party had continued on its way, leaving many more severed heads in its wake. I cannot remember any ever attempting to challenge Akira on any of these claims. Once I mentioned casually to my mother something about my friend's adventure beyond the settlement, and I do remember her smiling and saying something to cast doubt on the matter. I was furious at her, and thereafter I believe I carefully avoided revealing to her anything at all intimate concerning Akira. My mother, incidentally, was one person Akira regarded with a peculiar awe. If saying, despite his having got me in an arm lock, I was still loath to concede a point to him. I could always resort to declaring that he could have my mother to answer to. Of course, this was not something that I like to do readily. It rather hurt my pride to have invoked my mother's authority at such an age, but on those occasions I was obliged to do so. I was always amazed by the transformation brought about, how the merciless fiend with the vice-like grip could turn into a panic-stricken child. I was never sure why my mother should have such an effect on Akira, for although he was always exceedingly polite, he was on the whole unintimidated by adults. I could not, moreover, recall my mother ever having spoken to him in anything but a gentle and friendly way. I can remember pondering this question at the time, and various possibilities occurring to me. I did, for a while, consider the notion that Akira regarded my mother as he did because she was beautiful. That my mother was beautiful was something that I accepted quite dispassionately as fact throughout my growing up. It was being said of her that, and I believe I regarded this beautiful was simply a label that attached itself to my mother more significantly than tall or small or young. At the same time, I was not unaware of the effect of her beauty had on others. Of course, at that age, I had no real sense of deeper implications of feminine allure, but accompanying her from place to place as I did, came to take for granted, for instance, the admiring glances of strangers as we stroll through the public gardens, and the preferential treatment from the waiters in the Italian cafe in Nanking Road, where we would go for cakes and Saturday mornings. Whenever I look down at my photographs of her, I have 7 in all, in the album that accompanied me here from Shanghai, she strikes me as a beauty in an older Victorian tradition. Today, she might perhaps be regarded as handsome. Certainly, she is not pretty. I cannot imagine her, for instance, ever having had the repertoire of coquettish little shrugs or tosses of the head that we expect of our young women today. In the photographs, all of them taken before my birth, 4 in Shanghai, 2 in Hong Kong, and 1 in Switzerland, she is certainly elegant, stiff-backed, perhaps even haughty, but not without the gentleness around her eyes. I remember well. In any case, the point I'm making is that it was quite natural for me to suspect initially, at least, that Akira's odd attitude towards my mother derived, like many so other things, from her beauty. But when I thought the thing over more carefully, I recall settling on a more likely explanation, namely, that Akira had been unusually impressed by what he had witnessed the morning the company health inspector visited our house. It was an accepted feature of our lives to be visited from time to time by an official from Morgenburg and Bayet, some man who would spend an hour or so wandering about the house, noting things in his notebook, mumbling the occasional question. I remember my mother once telling me that when I was very young, I liked to play at being a Bayat health inspector, and that she often had to dissuade me from spending prolonged periods studying her lavatory arrangement with a pencil on my hand. This may well have been so, but as far as I can recall, these visits were mostly entirely eventless, and for years I did not think anything of them. I can see now, though, that these inspections, checking as they did not only by the hygiene matters, but also for signs of disease and parasites among the household members, were potentially embarrass- embar- potentially very embarrassing, and no doubt the individuals selected by the company to conduct them tended to be those of gift for tact and delicacy. Certainly, I remember a series of meek, shuffling men, usually English, though occasionally French, who were very carefully deferential not just to my mother but also to Mei Li, a point which always went down well with me. The inspector who turned up on that morning, I must have been 8, and was not at all typical. Today, I can remember in particular 2 things about him: that he had a drooping moustache, and that there was a brown mark, perhaps a tea stain, at the back of his hat disappearing into the band. I was playing alone at the front of the house on the round island of lawn circled by our carriage track. I remember it being overcast that day, and I had been absorbed in my game. But the man appeared at the gate, came walking towards the house. As he passed me, he muttered, "Hello, young man, mother in?" Then carried on without waiting for my reply. It was as I was staring at the back view that I noticed a stain on his hat. What I remember next must have occurred around an hour later. By the time Akira had arrived and we were busy up in my playroom, it was the sound of their voices, not raised exactly, but filled with growing tension, that caused both of us to look up from our game, then eventually to move stealthily out onto the landing and crouch beside the heavy oak cabinet outside the playroom door. Our house had a rather grand staircase, and from our vantage point beside the oak cabinet, we could see the gleaming banister rail following the curves of the stairs down to the spacious entrance hall. There, my mother and the inspector were standing facing each other, both very stiff and straight, near the center of the door, so that they looked rather like 2 opposing chess pieces left on the board. The inspector, I noticed, was clutching to his chest, his hat with the stain. For her part, my mother had her hand clasped just below her bosom, the way she did before she burst into a song on those evenings Mrs. Louise, the American curate's wife, came to play the piano. The altercation that followed, though no apparent significance in itself, I believe, came to mean something special to my mother, representing perhaps a key moment of moral triumph. I remember she would refer to it regularly as I grew older, as though it was something she wished me to take to my heart, and I remember often listening to her recount the whole story to visitor, usually concluding with a little laugh and observation that the inspector had been removed from his post shortly after the encounter. Consequently, I cannot be sure today how much of my memory of that morning derived from what I actually witnessed from the landing, as to what extent it has merged over time with my mother's account of the episode. In any case, my impression is that as Akira and I peered round the edge of the oak cabinet, the inspector was saying something like, "I have every respect for your sentiments, Mrs. Banks. Nevertheless, out there, one cannot be too careful, and the company does have a responsibility for all employees' welfare, even the more seasoned, such as yourself and Mr. Banks." "I'm sorry, Mr. Wright," my mother responded, "but your objections have yet to make themselves clear to me. These servants you talk of given excellent service over the years. I can vouch utterly for their standards of hygiene. And you have yourself admitted they show no signs of contagious illness. Nevertheless, madam, they are from Shantung, and the company is obliged to counsel all our employees against taking natives of the provinces into their houses, a stricture, may I say, derived from a bitter experience. Can you be serious? You wish me to drive out these friends of ours? Yes, we have been long considered them as friends, for no other reasons than that they hail from Shantung. At this, the inspector manner grew rather pompous. He proceeded to explain to my mother that the company's objection to servants from Shantung were based on doubts about not just their hygiene and health, but also their honesty. And with so many of items of value in the house belonging to the company, the inspector gestured around him. He was obliged to reiterate most strongly his recommendations. When my mother broke in again to ask on what basis such astonishing generalizations had been made, the inspector gave a weary sigh. He said, "In a word, madam, opium. Opium addiction in Shantung has now advanced to such a deplorable level that the entire villages are to be found enslaved to the pipe. Hence, Mrs. Banks, the low standards of hygiene, the high incidence of contagion, and inevitably those who come from Shantung to work in Shanghai, even if essentially of an honest disposition, tend sooner or later to resort to thieving for the sake of their parents, brothers, uncles, cousins, and what have you, all of whose cravings must somehow be pacified. Good gracious, madam, I'm simply trying to make my point." Not only was it the inspector who recoiled at this point. Beside me, Akira gave a sharp intake of breath, and when I glanced at him, he was staring down at my mother, open-mouthed. It is this picture of him at that moment which led me to later to believe his subsequent awestruck view of my mother originated from that morning. But if the inspector and Akira both started at something my mother did at some point, I did not myself see anything out of the ordinary. To me, she appeared to do no more than brace herself a little in preparation for what she was about to assert. But then, I suppose I was well used to her ways, possibly to those less familiar with them. Certainly, my mother's customary looks and posture in such situations might indeed have come over as somewhat alarming. This is not to say that I was not fully alert of the explosion that was about to follow. In fact, from the moment the inspector had uttered the word opium, I had known that the unfortunate man was done for. He had come to an abrupt halt, no doubt expecting to be cut off, but I recall my mother letting a hang of trembling silence throughout, which her glare never moved off the inspector, before finally asking in a quiet voice that nevertheless threatened to brim over with fury, "You presume, sir, talk to me on behalf of this, of all firms, about opium?" There followed a tirade of controlled ferocity in which she put to the inspector to the case, with which I was by then already familiar, and in which I was to hear the outline again many more times, that the British in general and the company of Morgan, Brooke and Byatt especially, by importing Indian opium into China in such massive quantities, have brought untold misery and degradation to the whole nation. As she spoke, my mother's voice often grew taut and never quite lost its measured quality. Finally, fixing her foe with a glare, she asked him, "Are you not ashamed, sir? As a Christian, as an Englishman, as a man with scruples, are you not ashamed to be in the service of such a company? Tell me, how is your conscience able to rest while you owe your existence to such ungodly wealth?" Had he had the temerity to do so, the inspector might have pointed out the appropriateness of my mother's admonishing him in such terms, in such words issuing from the wife of a fellow company employee, residing in the company house. But by this point, he had realized he was out beyond his depth, and muttering a few stock phrases to preserve his dignity, retreated from the house. In those days, it was still a surprise to me when any adult displayed as had the inspector ignorance of my mother's campaign against opium. Throughout much of my growing up, I held the belief that my mother was known and admired far and wide as the principal enemy of the great opium dragon of China. The opium phenomenon, should I say, was not something adults in Shanghai made much effort to hide from children, but of course, when I was very young, I understood little concerning the matter. I was accustomed to seeing each day, from the carriage that took me to school, the Chinese men in the doorways along Nanking Road sprawled in the morning sun, and for some time, whenever I heard my mother's campaigns, I imagined her to be assisting this specific group of men. Later, as I grew older, I had more opportunities to glimpse something of the complexity surrounding the issue. I was, for instance, required to present myself at my mother's luncheon. This would take place at our house, usually during the week when my father was at the office. Typically, 4 or 5 ladies would arrive and be led into the conservatory, where a table would have been laid amidst the creepers and palms. I would assist by passing up cups, saucers, and plates, and wait for the moment I knew would come when my mother asked her guests how, when they searched their hearts and conscience, they viewed their company's policy. At this point, the pleasant chatter would cease and ladies would listen silently as my mother went on to express her own deep unhappiness with our company's action, which she regarded as unchristian and un-British. As I remember it, these luncheons always become quiet and awkward from this stage on and until the moment not so long afterward when the ladies would utter the most frosty farewells and drift out to the waiting carriages and motor cars. But I knew from what my mother told me that she did win through to a number of these company wives, and the converts were then invited to her meetings. These latter were much more serious affairs, and I was not permitted to attend them. They would take place in the dining room behind closed doors, and if by the chance I was still in the house while a meeting was in progress, I would be required to tiptoe around silently. Occasionally, I would be introduced to a personage my mother had held a special esteem, a clergyman, say, or diplomatist, but by and large, Mei Li was instructed to have me well out of the way before the first guest arrived. Of course, Uncle Philip was one of those who are always present, and I often endeavored to be visible as the participant departed, so as to catch his eyes. If he spotted me, then invariably he would come over with a smile and would have a little talk. Sometimes, if he had no pressing engagement, I would take him aside to show him the drawings I had done that week, or else we might go and sit together for a while out in the back terrace. Once everyone had left, the atmosphere in the house would undergo a complete change. My mother's mood would invariably lighten, as though the meeting had swept away every one of her cares. I would hear her singing to herself as she went around the house, putting things back in order, and as soon as I did so, I would hurry out into the garden and wait, for I knew that once she has finished tidying, she would come out to find me, and whatever time she was left before lunch, she would devote entirely to me. Once I was older, it was during these periods. Good morning, guys. Good afternoon, guys. When I was older, it was during these periods, just after a meeting, my mother and I went for our walks in Jasville Park. But when I was 6 or 7, we tended to stay at home and play a board game, and sometimes even with my toy soldiers. I still remember a certain routine we developed around this time. In those days, there had been a swing on our lawn not far from the terrace. My mother would emerge from the house still singing, step on the grass and sit on the swing, and I would be waiting up on my mount at the back of the garden and come running up to her pretending to be furious. "Get off, mother, you'll break it!" I would jump up and down and before the swing and waving my arms about. You're much too big. You'll break it. And my mother, pretending she could neither see or hear me, would swing herself higher and higher, all the time continuing to sing at the top of her lungs some song like Daisy, Daisy, give me an answer do. When all my pleading had failed, I would, the logic of this now eludes me, attempt a succession of headstands on the grass in front of her. Her singing would then be punctuated by gales of laughter until eventually she calmed down from the swing and we would go off to play wherever I had prepared for us. Even now, I cannot think about my mother's meetings without remembering those eagerly anticipated moments that would always follow. A few years ago, I did spend some days in the reading room of the British Museum, researching into arguments that raged over the opium trade in China during those times. As I sifted through many newspapers, letters, and documents of the day, a number of issues that had mystified me as a child became much clearer. However, and I might as well admit this, my main motive in undertaking such research was the hope that I would come across the reports of my mother. After all, as I have said, I've been given to believe as a child that she was a key figure in the anti-opium campaigns. It was something of a disappointment then that I did not once find her name. There were others, repeatedly quoted, praised, denigrated, but all the material I collated, I did not once find my mother. I did, though, stumble on several mentions of Uncle Philip. Once in a letter of North China Daily News, a Swedish missionary in the process of condemning a number of European companies referred to Uncle Philip as the admirable beacon of rectitude. The absence of my mother's name was disappointment enough, but this was a cruel twist indeed, and I abandoned my researches thereafter. But I have no wish to recall Uncle Philip here just now. There was a time earlier that evening when I was convinced I had mentioned his name to Sarah Hemmings during our bus ride this afternoon, even told her one or two basic things about him, but going over yet again all that took place, I am now reasonably sure Uncle Philip did not come up at all. And I must say I am relieved. It may be a foolish way to think, but it has always been my feeling that Uncle Philip will remain a less tangible entity while he existed only in my memory. I did, though, tell her a little about Akira this afternoon, and now that I have chance to think it over, I do not really regret having done so. I did not, in any case, tell her very much, and she did appear genuinely interested, and I have no idea what it was that caused me suddenly to start talking to her about such matter. I certainly had no such intention when I boarded the bus with her in the Haymarket. I had been invited by David Corbett, a man I have come vaguely to know, to lunch with him and a few friends at a restaurant in Lower Regent Street. It's a fashionable lunch spot, and Corbett had booked a long table at the rear of the room for the dozen of us. I was pleased to see Sarah among the party and a little surprised, and since I had not been aware she was a friend of Corbett's, and arriving rather late, I was not able to sit within speaking range of her. It had clouded over by that time, and the waiter had lit for us a brace of candles on our table. One of our party, a fellow called Hagley, thought it was a good joke to blow the candles out and then to summon the waiter back to relight them. He did this at least 3 times in the space of 20 minutes whenever he judged the boisterous atmosphere to be sagging. The others did seem to find this amusing. From what I could see, Sarah was at this stage enjoying herself, laughing with the rest of them. We had been there for perhaps an hour, and a couple of the men had excused themselves and returned to their offices when attention turned to Emma Cameron, a rather intense girl sitting at Sarah's end of the table. For all I knew, she had already been talking for some time to those nearest her about her problem, but it was at this stage that a lulling over the rest of the table suddenly made her focus of the whole party. There were There followed a half-serious, half-ironic discussion of Emma Cameron's troubled relationship with her mother, which was evidently reaching to a new crisis on all accounts of Emma's recent engagement to a Frenchman. All kinds of advice were offered to her. The man, called Hagley, for instance, proposed that all mothers and aunts too naturally be kept in a large zoo-like institution to be reconstructed beside the serpentine. Others made more helpful comments based on their own experiences, and Emma Cameron, relishing all the attention, Alright, see you. Kept the topic well stoked with ever more theatrical anecdotes to illustrate the thoroughly exasperating nature of this particular parent. The discussion had been going on for perhaps 15 minutes when I saw Sarah rise and, mumbling a word to the host's ear, leave the room. The ladies' powder room was located on the lobby area of the restaurant, and the others, those who noticed her exit at all, no doubt assumed that that was where she was bound. But I had caught something in her face as she left, and after a few minutes I too rose and went out after her. I found her standing in the entrance of the restaurant, looking out for windows into the lower Regent Street. She did not notice me coming up to her until I touched her arm and asked, "Is everything all right?" She gave a start, and I noticed little traces of tears in her eyes, which she quickly tried to mask with a smile. "Oh yes, I'm fine. I felt a little stuffy, that's all. I'm fine now." She gave a little laugh and gazed out searchingly into the street. "I'm sorry, it must have looked awfully rude. I really should go back in." "I see no reason why you should if you don't want to." She studied me carefully, then asked, "Are they still talking about what they're talking about?" "They were when I left." Then I added, "I suppose neither of us is able to contribute much to the symposium on troublesome mothers." She suddenly laughed and wiped away her tears, now no longer trying to hide them from me. "No," she said, "I suppose we are disqualified." She smiled again and said, "It's so silly of me. After all, they're just having a nice lunch." "Are you expecting a car?" I asked, for she was still looking out earnestly at the traffic. "What? Oh, no, I was just looking." Then she said, "I was wondering if a bus would come. You see, look, over there, over the street. There's a stop. My mother and we used to spend a lot of time on buses, just the pleasure of it. I'm talking about when I was small. If we couldn't get the front seat on the top deck, then we just come straight down and wait for another one. And we spend hours sometimes going around London, looking at everything, talking and pointing things out to each other. I'm so used to enjoy it." Thank you for the follow! Thank you. Thank you so much. We hit 159? Yeah. One more. Thank you so much. I must confess, I tend to walk or get a cab. I'm rather afraid of London buses. I'm convinced if I get on one, it will take me somewhere that I don't want to go, and I'll spend the rest of my day trying to find my way back. "Shall I tell you something, Christopher?" Her voice had become very quiet. "It's very silly, but I only realized it recently. It had never occurred to me before, but Mother must already have been in a lot of pain. She wasn't strong enough to do other things with me. That's why we spent so much time on the buses. It was something we could still do together." Oh. Wait. Thank you. Thank you so much. Oh my god, we hit our target, guys. Let me Where's my... Well, now it's time to start a new goal. So 10 every time we hit a target, we will indeed add another target. You guys still here? Guys. Okay. Thank you, Hikaru Himuro, for the follow. Thank you, Snowman333, for the follow. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. It means a lot, by the way. Really, a follow means a lot. And we are very close to hitting 200 one day. And we shall try our best. I will try my best. Yay! Bunny. Would you care to ride on the bus now? I asked. She looked out again to the street. But aren't you very busy? It would be a pleasure. As I say, I'm rather frightened to go on buses alone. Since you're something of a veteran, then this is my opportunity. Very well. She suddenly beamed. I'll show you how you ride on a London bus. We eventually boarded not in the lower Regent Street. We did not wish the lunch party to emerge and see us waiting, but in nearby Haymarket. When we climbed the upper deck, she showed a childish delight in finding a front seat vacant, and we sat there swaying together in the bus vehicle lumbered its way towards Trafalgar Square. London looked very grey today, and down the pavements the crowds were well prepared with their macintoshes and umbrellas. I would suppose we spent a half hour on that bus, perhaps longer. She took in the Strand, Chancery Lane, Clerkenwell. Sometimes we sat looking at the view below us in silence. At other times we talked, usually innocuous things. Her mood had lightened considerably since lunch, and she did not mention her mother again. I'm not sure how we got on to the subject, but it was just after a lot of passengers had just got off the High Holborn. We were moving down the Gray's Inn Road that I found myself talking about Akira. I believe at first I did no more than mention him in passing, describing him as a childhood friend. But she must have probed me, for I remember not long afterwards saying to her with a laugh, I always think about the time we stole things together. Oh, she exclaimed, so that's it. The great detective has a secret criminal past. I knew this Japanese boy was significant. Do tell me about your robbery. Hardly a robbery. We were 10 years old. But it torments your conscience, even still. Not at all. It was just small things. We stole something from the servants' room. How fascinating. And this was in Shanghai? I suppose I must then have told her a few further things from the past. I did not reveal anything of any real significance, but after parting with her this afternoon, we eventually got off in New Oxfordshire, Oxford Street. I was surprised and slightly alarmed that I had told her anything at all. After all, I have not spoken to anyone about my past in all the time I have been in this country, and as I say, I had certainly never intended to start doing so today. But perhaps something of this sort has been on the cards for some time. For the truth is, over the past year I have become increasingly preoccupied with my memories, a preoccupation encouraged by the discovery of that these memories of my childhood, of my parents, have lately begun to blur. A number of times recently I found myself struggling to recall something that was just 2 or 3 years ago. I believe it was ingrained in my mind forever. I have been obliged to accept, in other words, that with each passing year, my life in Shanghai will grow less distinct until one day, all that will remain will be a few muddled images. Even tonight, when I sat down here and tried to gather some sort of order, these things I still remember. I have struck anew with how hazy so much have grown. To take, for instance, this episode I have just recounted concerning my mother and the health inspector, while I am fairly sure that I have remembered its essence accurately enough, turning it over in my mind again, I find myself less certain about some of the details. For one thing, I am no longer sure she actually put the inspector the actual words, "How is your conscience able to rest while you owe your existence to such ungodly wealth?" It now seems to me that even in her impassioned state, she would have been aware of the awkwardness of these words, of the fact that they left her quite open to ridicule. I do not believe my mother would have ever lost control of the situation to such a degree. On the other hand, it is possible I attributed these words to her precisely because such a question was one she must have put to herself constantly during our life in Shanghai. The fact that we owed our existence to a company whose activities she had identified as an evil to scourge must have been a source to a true torment to her. In fact, it is even possible I have remembered incorrectly the context in which she uttered these words, that it was not the health inspector she put this question, but to my father on another morning altogether during the argument in the dining room. Okay, I think I know where to stop now. That was end of chapter 4. We will indeed read chapter 5 and then we will end there. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we are currently reading When We Were Orphans by Kazuo Ishiguro, chapter 5. One moment for a sip of tea. Chapter 5 is a bit short, so I'm gonna continue. Give me one moment, please. Okay, chapter 5. I do not remember now if the dining room episode occurred before or after the health inspector's visit. What I recall is that it was raining hard that afternoon, making it gloomy throughout the house, and I've been sitting in the library watched over by Mei Li as I went through my arithmetic books. We call it the library, but I suppose it was just really an anteroom whose walls happened to be lined with books. There was just enough space in the middle of the floor for a mahogany table, and it was there I always did my schoolwork. My back to the double doors leading to the dining room, Mei Li, my ama, saw my education as a matter of solemn importance, and even when I had been working for an hour, it never occurred to her, as she stood sternly over me, to lean her weight on the shelf behind her, or to sit down in the upright chair opposite mine. The servants had long since learned not to blunder in those during these moments of study, and even my parents had accepted they should not disturb us unless absolutely necessary. It was then something of a surprise when my father came striding through the library that afternoon, oblivious to our presence, and went into the dining room, closing the doors firmly behind him. This intrusion was followed within minutes by another from my mother, who strode past briskly and disappeared into the dining room. During the minutes that followed, I could catch, even through the heavy doors, the occasional words or phrase that told me my parents were locked in arguments. But frustratingly, whenever I tried to hear a little bit more, whenever my pencil hovered too long over my sums, there would come Mei Li's inevitable reprimand. But then, I do not remember how. this come about, Mei Li was called away, and I was suddenly left alone at the library table. At first, I just continued to work, too fearful of what would happen if Mei Li returned and found me out of my chair. But the longer she was gone, the greater grew my urge to hear more clearly the muffled exchanges in the next room. I did finally rise and go to the doors, and even then, I would hurry back to the table every few seconds, convinced I could hear my Ama's footsteps. In the end, I managed to remain at the door only by keeping a ruler in my hand, so that if surprised by Mei Li, I could claim to be in the process of measuring the dimension of the room. Even so, I managed to hear the whole phrases only when my parents forgot themselves and raised their voices. I could make out in my mother's angry voice the same righteous tone she had used that morning to the health inspector. I heard her repeat, "A disgrace!" a number of times, and she referred often to what she called the sinful trade. At one point she said, "You are making us all party to it. All of us. It's a disgrace." My father too sounded angry, though in defensive, despairing sort of way. He kept saying things like, "It's not so simple. It's not nearly so simple." And at one point he shouted, "It's too bad. I'm not Philip. I'm not made that way. It's too bad. It's just too bad." There was something in his voice as he shouted this, a kind of terrible resignation, and I suddenly became furious at Mei Li for having abandoned me in such a situation. And it was perhaps then I was standing by those doors, my ruler in my hand, caught between the urge of continuing listening and the desire to flee into the sanctuary of my playroom and my toy soldiers, that I heard my mother utter those words. "Are you not ashamed to be in the service of such a company? How can your conscience rest while you owe your existence to such ungodly wealth?" I do not remember what occurred after that, whether Mei Li came back, if I was still in the library when my parents emerged. I do recall, though, that the episode heralded one of the longer periods of silence between my parents, that is to say, one that was maintained for weeks rather than days. I do not mean, of course, that my parents did not communicate at all during these times, just that all exchanges were kept to strictly functional. I was well used to such periods and never concerned myself unduly with them. In any case, it was only in the smallest way that they ever impinged upon my life. For instance, my father might appear at breakfast with a cheerful "Good morning, everyone," and slap his hands together, only to be met by my mother's frosty glare. On such occasions, my father might try to uncover his embarrassment by turning to me, and still in some cheery tone asking, "And how about you, Puffin? Any interesting dreams last night?" To which I knew from experience I should respond by giving a vague sound and continue to eat. Otherwise, as I say, I was able to go about my business more or less as usual, but I suppose I must at least sometimes have given thought to these matters, for I do have a memory of a particular conversation I had with Akira once when we were playing at his house. Thank you for coming by. Thank you. My memory of Akira's house is that from an architectural standpoint, it was very similar to ours. In fact, I remember my father telling me both houses had been built by the same British firm some 20 years earlier. But the inside of my friend's house was quite different affair, the source of fascination for me. It was not so much the preponderance of Oriental pictures and ornaments. In Shanghai, at that stage in my life, I would have seen nothing unusual in this, but rather his family's eccentric notions regarding usage of many items of Western furnitures. Rugs I would have expected to see on floors were hung on walls. Chairs would have been an odd height to tables. Lamps would totter under overly large shades. Most remarkable were the pair of replica Japanese rooms Akira's parents had created at the top of the house. They were small but uncluttered rooms with Japanese tatami mats fitted over the floors, and paper panels fixed to the walls, so that once inside, at least according to Akira, one could not tell one was not in an authentic Japanese house made of wood and paper. I could remember the doors to the rooms being especially curious. On the outer, western side, they were oak panel with shining brass knobs. On the inner side, Japanese side, delicate paper with lacquer inlays. In any case, one sweltering day, Akira and I had been playing in one of these Japanese rooms. He had been trying to teach me a game involving piles of cards that Japanese characters have on them. I had managed to pick up the rudiments, and we had been playing for several minutes when I suddenly asked him, "Does your father sometimes stop talking to your father?" He looked at me blankly, probably because he had failed to understand me. His English often let him down if I spoke out in context like this. Then, when I repeat my question, he shrugged and said, "Mother not talk to father when he at office. Mother not talk to father when he is in toilet." With that, he roared with theatrical laughter, rolled onto his back, and began kicking his feet in the air. I was Dutch obliged for the moment to drop the matter, but having raised it, I was determined to get his view, and a few minutes later brought it up again. This time, he seems to sense my earnestness, and leaving beside the card game, asked me a number of questions until I had more or less told him the nature of my worries. He then rolled up onto his back again, but this time gazed up thoughtfully up at the ceiling fan rotating above us, and after a few moments he said, "I know why they stopped. I know why." Then turning to me, he said, "Christopher, you not enough Englishman." When I asked him to explain this, he once more looked at the ceiling and went quiet. I too rolled on my back and followed his example of staring at the fan. He was lying a little way across the room from me, and when he spoke again, I remember his voice sounded oddly disembodied. "It's same for me," he said. "Father and mother, they stopped talk because I'm not Japanese enough." As I may have said already, I tended to regard Akira as a worldly authority on many aspects of life, so I listened to him that day with great care. My parents stopped talking to one another, he told me, whenever they became deeply unhappy with my behavior, and in my case, this was on account of my not behaving sufficiently like an Englishman. If I thought about it, he said, I would be able to link each of my parents' silences to some instance of my failing in this way. For his part, he always knew that he had let down his Japanese blood, and it never came to a surprise to him to discover that his parents had ceased talking to one another. When I asked him why did they not scold us in a usual manner when we misbehaved this way, Akira explained to me that it was not like that. He was talking of offenses quite different from the usual misdemeanors for which we might be punished. He was referring to moments that disappointed our parents so deeply they were unable to even scold us. Mother and father so very, very disappointed, he said quietly, so they stopped talk. Then he sat up and pointed to one slatted sun blinds at that moment hanging partially down over the window. We children, he said, were like twine that kept the slats held together. A Japanese monk once had told him this. We often failed to realize it, but it was we children who bound not only a family but the whole world together. If we do not do our part, the slats will fall and scatter over the floor. I do not remember anything more of our conversation that day, and besides, as I say, I did not spend much time dwelling on such matters. All the same, I remember more than once being tempted to ask my mother about what my friend had said. In the end, I never did so, though I did broach the subject with Uncle Philip. Uncle Philip was not a real uncle. He stayed with my parents as a house guest upon his arrival in Shanghai sometime before my birth, in the days when he was still in the employ of Morgan Brook and Byatt. But then, while I was still very young, he had resigned from the company owing to what my mother always described as a profound disagreement with his employers over how China should mature. By the time I was old enough to be aware of him, he was running a philanthropic organization called the Sacred Tree, dedicated to improving conditions of the Chinese areas of the city. He has always been a family friend, but as I have said, become a particularly frequent visitor over the years of my mother's anti-opium campaigns. I can remember often going to with my mother to Philip's office. This was located within the grounds of one of the churches in the city center. My guess now is that it was the Union Church in the Suzhou Road. Our carriage would drive right into the church ground and stop beside a large lawn shaded by the fruit tree. Here, despite the noises from the city around us, the atmosphere was tranquil, and my mother, stepping out of the carriage, would pause, raise her head, and remark, "The air is so much purer here." Her mood would lighten visibly, and sometimes, if we were a little early, mother and I would while away some minutes playing games on the grass. If we played tag, chasing one another all around the fruit tree, my mother would often laugh and squeal as excitedly as I did. I remember once, in the middle of one such game, she stopped suddenly on seeing a clergyman emerge from the church. We then stood quietly on the edge of the lawn and exchanged greetings with him as he had passed, but no sooner had he gone out of our sight, but then my mother turned and, stooping right down to me, given me a conspiratorial giggle. It is even possible this kind of thing occurred more than once. In any case, I remember being fascinated by the notion of my mother participating in something for which, just like me, she could be told off. And it was perhaps this dimension to these moments of careless play around the churchyard that made them seem always a little special for me. My memory of Uncle Philip's office is that it was very ramshackle. There were everywhere boxes of all sizes, heaps of papers, even loose drawers still with their contents stacked precariously one on another. I would have expected my mother to disapprove of such untidiness, but she only ever talked of Uncle Philip's office being cozy or busy. He never failed to make a fuss of me on these visits, shaking my hand heartily and sitting me down, then engaging me in conversation for several minutes, while my mother looked on smiling. Often he would give me a gift, something he would pretend he had ready and waiting, though I soon came to realize he was presenting me with whatever caught his eye at the moment. "Guess what I've got for you, Puffin," he would declare, while his gaze traveled the room in search of something suitable. In this way, I acquired an extensive collection of office items, which I kept in an old chest in my playroom: an ashtray, an ivory pen stand, a lead weight. There was one occasion when, after announcing he had a present for me, his eyes failed to alight on anything at all. There followed an awkward pause before he sprang up and began wandering about his office, muttering, "And where did I put it? What on earth have I done with it?" Until finally, perhaps in desperation, he went on over to the wall, pulled down a map of the Yangtze region, and tearing a corner as he did so, rolled it up and presented it to me. That time, I confided in him. Uncle Philip and I were sitting together in his office, waiting for my mother to come back from somewhere. He had persuaded me to take his own chair behind his desk, while he himself roamed aimlessly around the place. He was making his usual amusing small talk, and normally he would have me laughing in no time. But on that occasion, only days after my discussion with Akira, I was not in that sort of mood. Uncle Philip soon saw this and said, "So, Puffin, we are rather gloom today." I saw my chance and said, "Uncle Philip, I was just wondering, how do you suppose one might become more English?" "More English?" He stopped whatever he was doing and looked at me. Then, With a thoughtful expression, he came nearer, put a chair up to the desk, and sat down. Now, why would you want to be more English than you are, Puffin? I just thought, well, I just thought I might. Who says that you're not sufficiently English already? No one really. Then after a second I added, but I think perhaps my parents think so. And what do you think, Puffin? Do you think you ought to be more English? I can't really tell, sir. No, I suppose you can't. Well, it's true. Out here, you're growing up with a lot of different sorts around you. Chinese, French, German, Americans, what have you. It would be no wonder if you grew up a little bit more of a mongrel. He gave a short laugh. Then he went on. But that's not a bad thing. You know what I think, Puffin? I think it would be no bad thing if boys like you grew up with a bit of everything. We might all treat each other a good deal better then. Be less of these wars for one thing. Oh yes, perhaps one day all these conflicts will end, and it won't be because of great statesmen or churches or organizations like this one. It will be because people changed. They'll be like you, Puffin. More of a mix. So why not become a mongrel? It's healthy. But if I did, everything might... I stopped. Everything might what, Puffin? Like that blind there, I pointed. If the twine broke, everything might scatter. Uncle Philip stared at the blind I had indicated. Then he rose and went to the window and touched it gently. Everything might scatter. You might be right. I suppose it's something that we can't easily get away from. People need to feel belong to a nation, to a race. Otherwise, who knows what might happen? This civilization of ours, perhaps it would just collapse, and everything will scatter as you put it. He sighed, as though I had just defeated him in an argument. So, you want to be more English? Well, Puffin. So what are we to do about it? I wondered if it's alright, sir. If you didn't awfully mind, I wonder if I might copy you sometimes. Copy me? Yes, sir. Just sometimes. Just so that I learn to do things the English way. That's very flattering, old fellow. But don't you think your father's the one to have this great privilege? About as English as they come, I would say. I looked away, and Uncle Philip must have immediately sensed that he had said the wrong thing. He came back to his chair and sat down in front of me again. Look, he said quietly. I'll tell you what we'll do. If you are ever worried about how you should go about things, anything, if you're worried about the proper way to go about it, then just come to me and we'll have a good talk about it. We'll talk about it through until you know exactly what's what. Now, feel better? Yes, sir, I think I do. I managed a smile. Thank you, sir. Look here, Puffin. You're a right little horror. You know that, of course, but as little horrors go, you are a pretty decent specimen. I'm sure your mother and father are very, very proud of you. Do you really think so, sir? I do. I really do. So you feel better? With that, he sprang to his feet and resumed his wanderings around his office. Reverting to his light-hearted tone, he began to some nonsensical story about the lady in the office next door, which had me in stitches. How fond I was of Uncle Philip. Is there any real reason to suppose he was not genuinely fond of me? It is perfectly possible that at that stage he wished nothing but good for me, that he had no more inkling than I did of course the things would take. No more inkling than I did of the course things would take. And that is the end of chapter 5. I think I read a lot today. Let me see. I think I shall stop here. Another chapter will turn to be 3 o'clock, so I think I better stop here before I get too. I read too long and then I lose my voice. Alright, guys. Alright. Thank you for being here. Oh shit. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, Diane, for helping me out. Thank you so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Cicero. Okay. Okay. We hit 170 followers. Thank you so much to Hikaru Himuro and Snowman333 for the follow. Let me see. Who else followed? Thank you, Deanne. Thank you, Twisty, for being here for moderating. Thank you, Swiss Roll. Thank you, Piao. Somehow you always managed to make it. Dakrai 091. The face when no girlfriend. I wonder what that's about. And I wonder if you are still here. Dakrai.
Hell yeah, we did it.
Oh yeah, we did it. Yeah. Thank you to King Komodo, even though King Komodo has left for work. King Komodo has always been a supporter. Yeah. Man, this is a long book, and this is not even the longest book that he has written. He has even longer books than this, so I'm really worried about the next few readings, to be honest. I'm trying to read like an entire book in a week, but I think there's like some books that really need more than 1 week to read. Something to the extent of like I Am a Cat by Natsume Soseki. Alright, guys, thank you once again for being here. Thank you, Dean. I hope you guys aren't bored by the story. I enjoy it thoroughly. It's a very Kazuo Ishiguro book. If you read a lot of Kazuo Ishiguro books, it's like very Kazuo Ishiguro style. So, some people might not enjoy it because it's so like, oh, I remember when these things happen. I remember when that things happen. When I remember, like this book is very similar. The way it's written is very similar to The Remains of the Day. I feel, yeah, it's a lot. There's like a lot of reminiscence, a lot of like, oh, back in those days, I'm like I might not remember it that way, but it could be remembered that way, or maybe that person never said things that way, but maybe they said things that way to another person. I must have mistaken it. It's very, very similar to The Remains of the Day. So there's definitely that Kazuo Ishiguro style, for sure. Yeah, and and lengthy, just lengthy, really. It's just very Kazuo Ishiguro style to be that way. But yes, I will be back on Wednesday. I'll be back on Wednesday. I can't even stand in between I put them too close. I'll be back on Wednesday. Yeah, very similar style to Remains of the Day. Very extremely similar style to Remains of the Day. It made me feel like I've read this before. Yeah, that's the very deja vu kind of feeling when I was reading it. Yeah, and I really should wake up earlier than I should. I always woke up late and then I start my stream late and everything. Yeah. Anyways, thank you for being here today. Thank you for all the follows. We hit our goal and we have a next goal. Wait, 170, right? What's the next goal? Wait, what's the next goal? Yeah, 170. We have 160 now. Okay, 170. We will indeed hit 180 soon. 170 soon, not 180. Thank you for the follows. Thank you for everything. Thank you for listening. Thank you to YouTube people who are listening this on YouTube. I really appreciate it. There's like a sub-genre of like people on YouTube who are actually looking for like the audio reading of the books. I apologize for my poor reading. And my occasional stops and stutters. English is my second language. I do try my very best. And for that, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for staying here with me today. Let's enjoy the start of the week, and I'll see you guys soon. I'll see you guys on Wednesday morning, 11 a.m. GMT plus 8 as usual. Thank you so much, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.
Have you ever had a dream that you could know you want to know
Good to see Dakrai is still here. Thank you, Dakrai. Thank you so much. I'll see you guys soon. Bye. Go eat. Everyone, go have lunch. Bye. See you guys soon.